The emergence of the Belgae as a distinct cultural and political entity represents one of the most significant developments in late Iron Age northwestern Europe. Their origins trace back to the complex interplay of indigenous populations and migrating Celtic groups during the transition from the Hallstatt to Latene cultural periods, roughly between 500 and 250 BC. This formative era witnessed the consolidation of various tribal confederations that would eventually challenge Rome itself and leave an indelible mark on European history. Archaeological excavations across modern Belgium, northern France and the Rhine Valley have revealed compelling evidence of Proto-Belgic cultures emerging from established Hallstatt traditions around 500 BC. The Hallstatt culture, characterized by its sophisticated ironworking techniques and elaborate burial practices, had dominated Central and Western Europe from approximately 800 to 450 BC. As this cultural horizon began to evolve, communities in the Low Countries and adjacent regions developed distinctive material signatures that would eventually coalesce into recognizably Belgic patterns. The transition manifested most clearly in burial practices and settlement organization. Early Proto-Belgic sites show a gradual shift from the characteristic Hallstatt wagon burials and princely tumuli toward more egalitarian grave goods distribution, though elite differentiation never disappeared entirely. At Vinnegem in modern Belgium, excavations have uncovered cemetery sites dating to the early 5th century BC that demonstrate this cultural transformation. The graves contain iron weapons, including long swords and spearheads, bronze fibulae with distinctive local decorative motifs, and pottery that blends Hallstatt forms with emerging Latene stylistic elements. The Latene cultural horizon, named after the Swiss archaeological site where its distinctive art style was first identified, began influencing Belgic territories around 450 BC. This influence arrived not through wholesale population replacement, but through gradual cultural diffusion and selective adoption of new technologies, artistic styles, and social practices. Belgic craftsmen adapted Latene decorative motifs to their own aesthetic preferences, creating hybrid forms that retained regional characteristics while participating in broader Celtic cultural networks. Metalworking traditions provide particularly clear evidence of this cultural synthesis. Bronze and iron artifacts from sites like Liebekees in Hainaut province demonstrate sophisticated technical knowledge combined with distinctive decorative schemes. Belgic smiths developed specialized techniques for producing weapons and tools that combined functional efficiency with aesthetic appeal. Their swords, characterized by long blades with parallel edges and elaborate hilts, became renowned throughout Celtic Europe for their quality and distinctive appearance. The migration patterns that shaped early Belgic settlement remain partially obscured by limited written sources, but archaeological evidence suggests complex movements of peoples and cultural influences rather than simple directional migrations. The Nervii, who would later become one of the most prominent Belgic tribes, appear to have established themselves in the valleys of the Sambre and Meuse rivers during this period. Their settlements, identified through distinctive pottery assemblages and settlement patterns, show evidence of gradual territorial expansion and consolidation throughout the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. Contemporary with the Nervii, the Ambieni were establishing their presence in the Somme Valley region of what is now northern France. Archaeological evidence from sites near modern Amiens reveals a complex settlement hierarchy, with larger fortified centres surrounded by smaller agricultural communities. The Ambiani developed particularly sophisticated pottery traditions, producing wheel-thrown vessels with geometric decorations that became widely traded throughout Belgic territories. The Atrebates, whose name derives from a Celtic root meaning inhabitants or dwellers, settled primarily in the Artois region. Their material culture shows strong connections to both British and continental Celtic traditions, suggesting they may have participated in cross-channel networks from an early period. Excavations at Etrun have revealed evidence of specialized craft production, including high-quality metalwork and distinctive glass beads that indicate participation in long-distance trade networks. These tribal groups, along with numerous smaller confederated peoples, gradually developed a shared Belgic identity that transcended individual tribal boundaries. This identity manifested in common artistic styles, similar settlement patterns, and increasingly standardized material culture. The process was neither uniform nor rapid, but by the 3rd century BC, archaeological assemblages across Belgic territories show remarkable consistency in key cultural markers. Settlement patterns during this formative period reveal sophisticated territorial organization and defensive planning. The Belgae developed a distinctive tradition of fortified settlements known as oppida, though their examples differed significantly from the massive hill forts constructed by other Celtic peoples. Belgic oppida typically occupied naturally defensible positions along river valleys or on elevated plateaus, but they were generally smaller and more numerous than their counterparts in Gaul or Britain. The Oppidum at AC Romance in the Ardennes provides exceptional insight into early Belgic settlement organisation. Occupied from the 3rd century BC onward, the site reveals careful urban planning with distinct residential, craft production, and ceremonial areas. The settlement's defensive earthworks, consisting of timber-reinforced ramparts and deep ditches, demonstrate sophisticated engineering knowledge adapted to local topographical conditions. Within the fortifications, excavations have uncovered evidence of specialized craft workshops, including areas dedicated to ironworking, bronze casting, and pottery production. Residential structures within Belgic settlements typically consisted of rectangular timber buildings with stone foundations, representing a departure from the circular houses common among other Celtic peoples. These structures, ranging from simple single-room dwellings to complex multi-room compounds, were arranged along well-planned street systems that facilitated both daily activities and defensive coordination. The buildings themselves show evidence of sophisticated construction techniques, including advanced joinery methods and efficient heating systems adapted to the region's climate. The material culture that emerged from these settlements reveals the development of distinctively Belgic artistic and technological traditions. Pottery production became increasingly standardized, with characteristic forms including large storage jars with cordon decoration, fine tableware with geometric patterns, and specialized cooking vessels adapted to local dietary preferences. The pottery shows technical excellence in both firing techniques and decorative application, indicating the presence of skilled specialists and organized production systems. Metalwork reached particularly high standards during this period, with Belgic craftsmen developing distinctive styles that combined functional efficiency with aesthetic sophistication. Iron tools and weapons demonstrate advanced knowledge of metallurgical techniques, including selective hardening and sophisticated tempering methods. Bronze work, while less common than iron, shows exceptional artistic achievement in items such as torques, bracelets, and decorative fittings for wooden objects. The torques produced by Belgic craftsmen deserve particular attention for their technical and artistic merit. These neck rings, symbols of elite status throughout the Celtic world, show distinctive regional characteristics in their construction and decoration. Belgic examples typically feature twisted wire construction, with elaborate terminals decorated with geometric or zoomorphic motifs. The gold torque discovered at Frane-les-Enveigne demonstrates the highest level of craftsmanship with intricate repousse work and granulation techniques that rival contemporary Mediterranean examples. Trade networks developed by the early Belgae extended far beyond their immediate territories, connecting them to both Germanic peoples across the Rhine and Mediterranean civilizations through various intermediaries. Evidence for these connections appears in the archaeological record through the presence of imported goods and the adoption of foreign technologies and artistic motifs. Contact with Germanic tribes across the Rhine involved both peaceful exchange and periodic conflict. Archaeological evidence suggests regular trade in raw materials, particularly iron ore and salt, in exchange for manufactured goods and luxury items. Germanic amber appears regularly in Belgic archaeological contexts, while Belgic metalwork has been found in Germanic settlements across the river. These exchanges facilitated cultural diffusion in both directions, with Germanic influences visible in certain aspects of Belgic material culture, particularly in pottery styles and decorative motifs. Mediterranean connections, while less direct than those with Germanic peoples, proved equally significant for Belgic cultural development. The Greek colony of Massalia served as a crucial intermediary, facilitating the flow of Mediterranean goods northward through established trade routes. Wine amphorae from Mediterranean sources appear in elite Belgic contexts, indicating participation in the prestige goods networks that characterized late Iron Age Europe. These Mediterranean connections introduced new technologies and artistic influences that Belgic craftsmen adapted to local preferences and needs. Glassworking techniques, probably derived ultimately from Mediterranean sources, appear in Belgic contexts by the 3rd century BC. Belgic glassworkers developed distinctive local styles, producing beads and ornaments that combined Mediterranean technical knowledge with indigenous aesthetic preferences. The adoption of coinage represents another significant Mediterranean influence on Belgic culture. While the Belgae did not begin producing their own coins until the 2nd century BC, imported Greek and later Roman coins appear in archaeological contexts from the 3rd century onward. These early coins likely functioned more as prestige objects than practical currency, but their presence indicates Belgic participation in broader European economic networks. Cultural exchanges extended beyond material goods to include religious and social practices. Celtic religious traditions, characterized by the veneration of natural features and the practice of ritual deposition, show distinctive regional variations in Belgic territories. Ritual deposits in rivers and springs, common throughout the Celtic world, take on particular characteristics in Belgic contexts, with emphasis on weapons and tools rather than personal ornaments. The famous deposit at the source of the Seine, while technically outside Belgic territory, provides insight into religious practices that were shared across Celtic Europe. Similar deposits in Belgic rivers such as the Sambre and Meuse suggest participation in pan-Celtic religious traditions while maintaining regional distinctiveness. The objects deposited typically include weapons, tools and ornaments that show clear Belgic stylistic characteristics, indicating that religious practices serve to reinforce cultural identity even while participating in broader traditions. The religious foundations established during the formative centuries provided the spiritual framework that would bind the emerging Belgic Confederation into a coherent political entity. By 250 BC, the scattered tribal groups had evolved into a sophisticated alliance system that balanced local autonomy with collective security and shared cultural identity. This confederation operated through a complex network of kinship ties, mutual obligations, and territorial agreements that allowed individual tribes to maintain their distinct identities while presenting a unified front against external threats. The political structure of the Belgic Confederation defied simple categorization, resembling neither the centralized monarchies of Mediterranean civilizations nor the loose tribal associations common among other Celtic peoples. Instead, the Belgae developed a flexible system of overlapping jurisdictions and rotating leadership that could adapt to changing circumstances while maintaining essential unity. At its core, the Confederation consisted of approximately 15 major tribal groups, each controlling defined territories that stretched from the Seine Valley in the south to the Rhine Delta in the north. The Nervi occupied the central position within this confederation, controlling the fertile valleys of the Sambre and Meuse rivers. Their territory extended from the forested Ardennes in the south to the coastal plains near modern Antwerp in the north. Archaeological evidence from sites like Belgae and Avesnelles reveals a sophisticated settlement hierarchy, with the Nervi maintaining several fortified centres that served as administrative and ceremonial focal points. The largest of these, located near modern Belgae, covered approximately 40 hectares and contained specialised quarters for craft production, religious activities and elite residences. The Ambiani controlled the Somme Valley and its tributaries, establishing their primary centre near modern Amiens. Their territory provided crucial access to the English Channel, making them essential partners in cross-channel trade and communication. Excavations at Ribemont-sur-Ancre have revealed extensive ritual complexes that suggest the Ambiani played a particularly important role in Confederation religious ceremonies. The site contains evidence of large-scale gatherings, including temporary structures capable of accommodating hundreds of participants from across Belgic territories. North of the Ambiani, the Morini occupied the coastal regions from the Somme estuary to the Rhine Delta. Their strategic position controlling channel crossings made them wealthy through trade tolls and customs duties. The Morini developed specialised knowledge of maritime navigation and shipbuilding, constructing vessels capable of carrying substantial cargo loads across the treacherous waters between continental Europe and Britain. Their settlements at sites like Boulogne-sur-Mer show evidence of sophisticated harbour facilities and shipyards that could accommodate vessels of various sizes. The Atrebets maintained control over the Artois region and portions of modern Belgium, serving as intermediaries between the coastal tribes and those of the interior. Their territory contained important iron deposits that provided raw materials for weapons and tools throughout the Confederation. Archaeological evidence from Arras and surrounding sites reveals extensive mining operations and specialised metalworking centres that produce standardised weapons and tools for distribution across Belgic territories. Further east, the Eburones controlled territories along the Meuse Valley and into the Ardennes forests. Their position gave them access to important trade routes connecting the Rhine Valley with central Gaul, making them wealthy through tolls and commercial activities. The Eburones maintained several fortified positions along major river crossings, including substantial works at sites near modern Tongeren and Liège. These positions allowed them to control traffic along the Meuse while providing secure bases for military operations. The Treveri, though sometimes considered peripheral to the core Belgic Confederation, maintained important connections with other tribal groups through marriage alliances and shared religious practices. Their territory along the Moselle Valley provided access to Germanic markets across the Rhine, making them valuable partners in long-distance trade networks. The Treveri developed distinctive artistic styles that blended Belgic, Germanic, and Mediterranean influences, producing luxury goods that were highly prized throughout northwestern Europe. Territorial boundaries between these major tribal groups were not rigid lines, but rather zones of overlapping influence and shared resources. River valleys often served as natural boundaries, but the actual limits of tribal authority could shift based on seasonal activities, marriage alliances, and military circumstances. The Belgae developed sophisticated legal mechanisms for resolving territorial disputes, including formal arbitration procedures and compensatory arrangements that allowed for peaceful resolution of most conflicts. The Confederation operated through a council system that brought together representatives from each major tribal group for discussions of common concerns. These assemblies typically convened during major religious festivals, combining political deliberations with ceremonial activities that reinforced cultural unity. The location of these meetings rotated among different tribal centres, ensuring that no single group could dominate Confederation politics through geographical advantages. Leadership within individual tribes followed patterns common throughout the Celtic world, with authority divided between war chiefs, religious leaders, and civil administrators. War chiefs, typically chosen from established noble families, held responsibility for military operations and external relations. Their authority was generally temporary, activated during periods of conflict or external threat. During peacetime, civil leaders drawn from the same noble families managed internal affairs, trade relations, and legal disputes. The social hierarchy that supported this political system rested on a complex interplay of birth, wealth, and achievement that created multiple pathways to elite status. At the apex stood the noble families who claimed descent from legendary heroes and maintained their positions through inherited wealth, military prowess, and religious authority. These families controlled the largest agricultural estates, the most productive mines and workshops, and the most important trade connections. Noble status manifested itself through distinctive material culture that archaeologists can trace through burial practices and settlement patterns. Elite graves from this period contain elaborate weapon sets, including long swords with decorated scabbards, spears with ornate points, and shields with bronze fittings. Personal ornaments such as gold torques, bronze bracelets, and imported glass beads demonstrate participation in long-distance trade networks and access to luxury goods. The warrior culture that permeated Belgic society created opportunities for social advancement based on military achievement. Young men from non-noble families could gain recognition and wealth through exceptional performance in battle, raiding expeditions, or single combat. Successful warriors received gifts of weapons, animals, and land from their leaders, gradually accumulating the resources necessary to establish their own followings and achieve quasi-noble status. Archaeological evidence from weapon deposits and battlefield sites reveals the sophisticated military equipment and tactics employed by Belgic warriors. The standard warrior carried a long iron sword suspended from a decorated belt, a wooden shield reinforced with iron bosses and rim fittings, and one or more spears designed for both throwing and thrusting. Elite warriors possessed additional equipment including mail armor, bronze helmets, and ceremonial weapons reserved for special occasions. The importance of cattle and agricultural wealth in determining social status reflected the fundamentally rural character of Belgic society. Large herds of cattle, sheep, and pigs served as both practical resources and symbols of prosperity. Cattle were particularly significant, serving as units of value in commercial transactions and legal settlements. The size of an individual's herds directly correlated with their social standing and political influence within their community. Agricultural estates belonging to noble families typically included extensive arable lands worked by dependent farmers, pastures for livestock, and specialized facilities for craft production. These estates operated as largely self-sufficient economic units that could support substantial numbers of retainers, craftsmen, and agricultural workers. The archaeological record reveals sophisticated farm buildings, storage facilities, and processing areas that indicate highly organized agricultural production. Craftsmen occupied an intermediate position within Belgic social hierarchy, possessing specialized skills that made them valuable to elite patrons while lacking the hereditary status of noble families. Master smiths, in particular, enjoyed considerable prestige due to the essential nature of their products and the mystical associations surrounding metalworking. The finest craftsmen maintained workshops within elite settlements and received patronage from multiple noble families, allowing them to accumulate substantial wealth and social influence. The role of druids within Belgic society extended far beyond simple religious functions to encompass legal, educational, and political responsibilities. Druids served as judges in legal disputes, maintained oral traditions that preserved tribal histories and genealogies, and provided the ritual expertise necessary for important ceremonies. Their training required decades of study and memorization, creating a learned class that commanded respect across tribal boundaries. Druidical education centers, identified through archaeological evidence of large gathering places and ritual deposits, served multiple tribal communities simultaneously. The site at Ribemont-sur-Ancre appears to have functioned as one such centre, with evidence of seasonal assemblies that brought together druids from across Belgic territories. These gatherings facilitated the standardization of legal procedures, religious practices, and cultural traditions that helped maintain Confederation unity. Religious practices among the Belgae combined ancient Celtic traditions with local innovations and foreign influences absorbed through trade and cultural contact. The veneration of natural features remained central to Belgic spirituality, with sacred groves, springs, and rivers serving as focal points for community religious activities. These natural sanctuaries were enhanced with wooden structures, stone altars, and ritual deposits that accumulated over generations of continuous use. Sacred groves, known from classical sources as nemiton, provided settings for the most important religious ceremonies. Archaeological investigations at sites like Gournay-sur-Aronde have revealed the remains of wooden temples surrounded by ritual enclosures where weapons, tools, and personal ornaments were deposited as offerings to the gods. The careful arrangement of these deposits suggests sophisticated ritual procedures that required specialized knowledge and formal training. The pantheon of deities worshipped by the Belgae included both widespread Celtic gods and local spirits associated with particular locations or tribal groups. Taranis, the thunder god, received particular veneration among warrior classes, while Epona, the horse goddess, was especially important to communities that relied heavily on cavalry tactics. Local deities often took the form of personified rivers, forests, or mountains that played important roles in tribal origin, myths, and territorial claims. Ritual deposits in rivers and springs represent one of the most distinctive aspects of Belgic religious practice. These offerings, typically consisting of weapons, tools, and personal ornaments, were carefully selected and prepared before being consigned to the waters. The weapons often show evidence of ritual killing through deliberate bending or breaking, suggesting beliefs about the spiritual transformation of objects offered to the gods. The famous weapon deposit at Lateny itself, though located outside core Belgic territory, provides insight into the scale and sophistication of these ritual practices. Similar deposits in Belgic rivers such as the Sambre near Thuin and the Scheldt near Tournai contain hundreds of objects spanning several centuries of continuous deposition. The consistency of these practices across different tribal territories suggests shared religious beliefs and coordinated ceremonial procedures. Burial customs during this period reveal complex beliefs about death and the afterlife that influence social organization and material culture. The majority of Belgic burials followed cremation practices, with the deceased's ashes placed in ceramic urns and buried in formal cemeteries located near major settlements. Grave goods varied significantly based on the social status, age, and gender of the deceased, providing archaeologists with detailed information about social hierarchies and cultural values. Elite burials often included complete weapon sets, imported luxury goods, and large quantities of pottery vessels, presumably containing food and drink for the afterlife journey. The burial of weapons with male warriors continued throughout the period, though the specific types and arrangements evolved in response to changing military technologies and social customs. Female elite burials typically contained jewellery, textile working tools, and ceramic vessels, reflecting their roles in household management and craft production. The economic foundations that sustained this complex society rested on sophisticated agricultural systems, specialised craft production, and extensive trade networks that connected Belgic communities with markets throughout northwestern Europe. Agriculture provided the basic subsistence needs of the population, while generating surpluses that supported non-agricultural specialists and funded long-distance trade activities. Belgic farmers developed agricultural techniques well suited to the region's climate and soil conditions. They cultivated various grains including wheat, barley, and oats, using iron ploughshares and other advanced tools that increased productivity compared to earlier Bronze Age methods. Archaeological evidence from sites like AC Romance reveals sophisticated storage facilities, including underground silos and elevated granaries that protected harvested grain from moisture and pests. Animal husbandry played an equally important role in the Belgic economy, with cattle, sheep, pigs and horses providing meat, dairy products, leather and transportation. Cattle remained the most prestigious livestock, serving as measures of wealth and units of exchange in commercial transactions. The management of large herds required extensive pasture lands and sophisticated knowledge of animal breeding and veterinary care. Iron production became increasingly important during this period, as demand for weapons, tools and agricultural implements expanded with population growth and military conflicts. The Belgae controlled several important iron-producing regions, including deposits in the Ardennes and areas controlled by the Atrebates. Iron-working sites reveal evidence of specialized production techniques, including bloomery furnaces, water-powered hammers, and standardized tool production that supplied markets throughout the Confederation. Intertribal trade flourished within the Confederation, facilitated by shared cultural practices, standardized weights and measures, and formal agreements that protected merchants and their goods. Regular markets held at major settlements brought together traders from different tribal territories, creating opportunities for cultural exchange as well as commercial transactions. These markets featured specialized facilities including permanent stalls, storage warehouses, and areas designated for livestock trading. The Confederation's strategic position between Germanic territories, Central Gaul and Britain made it a crucial intermediary in long-distance trade networks that connected diverse European regions. Belgic merchants developed expertise in evaluating and transporting various goods, including metals, textiles, pottery, and luxury items that commanded high prices in distant markets. Their reputation for fair dealing and reliable delivery made them preferred partners for merchants from other regions seeking access to northern European markets. The sophisticated trade networks that had enriched the Belgic Confederation throughout the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC inevitably brought them into contact with the expanding Roman sphere of influence. By 100 BC, Roman merchants, diplomats and military observers had begun appearing in Belgic territories, initially through intermediary relationships with Gallic tribes who had already established formal connections with the Republic. These early encounters would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Belgic civilization, introducing new political pressures, economic opportunities, and military challenges that tested the Confederation's adaptive capabilities. The Aedui, controlling territories in modern Burgundy, served as the primary conduit for initial Roman-Belgic relations. Their strategic position along the Saône Valley had made them wealthy intermediaries in Mediterranean trade, and their alliance with Rome, formalized around 120 BC, granted them privileged access to Roman markets and military support. Aeduan merchants began appearing in Belgic territories during the early 1st century BC, carrying Roman goods northward and facilitating diplomatic communications between Roman officials and Belgic leaders. Archaeological evidence from sites like Belgae and Amiens reveals the material impact of these early Roman connections. Roman wine amphorae, previously rare in Belgic contexts, become increasingly common in elite burial and settlement assemblages after 100 BC. These vessels, manufactured in Italian workshops and transported through Aeduan networks, represented more than simple trade goods. They symbolized participation in Roman dining customs and social practices that carried significant prestige value among Belgic nobility. The Sequani, controlling territories along the Upper Rhine, provided another crucial link between Roman and Belgic spheres. Their position gave them access to both Germanic markets across the Rhine and Roman territories to the south, making them valuable partners for Belgic traders seeking to diversify their commercial relationships. Sequani merchants brought Roman manufactured goods, including bronze vessels, glass objects, and fine pottery into Belgic markets while carrying Belgic products southward to Roman consumers. Roman diplomatic practices differed significantly from the personal relationships and kinship ties that had traditionally governed intertribal relations in northern Gaul. Roman envoys operated under formal mandates from the Senate, carrying written instructions and authorized to negotiate specific terms on behalf of the Republic. These diplomatic missions typically focused on securing favorable trading conditions, gathering intelligence about tribal military capabilities, and identifying potential allies for future military operations. The Romans demonstrated particular interest in Belgic military organization and warrior culture. Roman observers noted the Confederation's ability to mobilize substantial forces quickly and coordinate operations across multiple tribal territories. Intelligence reports preserved in later historical accounts describe Belgic warriors as exceptionally fierce fighters who employed distinctive tactics combining individual combat skills with disciplined formation fighting. These assessments would prove crucial when Roman military planners began contemplating operations in northern Gaul. Belgic responses to these early Roman overtures varied significantly among different tribal groups and individual leaders. Some nobles saw opportunities to enhance their wealth and prestige through Roman connections, importing luxury goods and adopting Roman customs to distinguish themselves from their peers. Others viewed Roman influence with suspicion, recognizing the potential threat to traditional authority structures and cultural practices that had sustained the Confederation for generations. The Nervii, occupying the central position within the Confederation, initially maintained cautious neutrality toward Roman advances. Their leaders participated in diplomatic exchanges and permitted Roman merchants to operate within their territories, but they avoided formal alliances that might compromise their independence. Archaeological evidence from Nervian sites shows selective adoption of Roman goods, with emphasis on practical items like tools and weapons rather than luxury objects that might indicate deeper cultural accommodation. The devastating impact of the Cimbrian Teutonas invasions between 113 and 101 BC fundamentally altered the strategic landscape of northern Europe and accelerated Belgic integration into Roman political networks. These Germanic tribes, driven from their homelands by climatic changes and population pressure, swept through Gaul in massive migrations that displaced established populations and disrupted traditional territorial arrangements. The invasions affected Belgic territories both directly, through military conflicts and population movements, and indirectly, through the broader destabilization of Gallic political systems. The Cimbri, estimated by Roman sources to number over 300,000 including non-combatants, initially moved westward from their homeland in Jutland around 113 BC. Their migration route took them through Germanic territories along the Rhine before entering Gaul near modern Strasbourg. The sheer scale of this population movement created massive logistical challenges, as the migrants required extensive territories for their herds, agricultural activities, and temporary settlements during their prolonged journey. Contemporary accounts describe the Cimbri as formidable warriors who fought with distinctive weapons and tactics that differed significantly from both Celtic and Roman military practices. Their warriors carried long swords and heavy spears, fought primarily on foot in dense formations, and employed psychological warfare techniques including war cries and intimidating appearance modifications. The women accompanying the migration reportedly participated in combat operations and served as fierce defenders of the baggage trains and temporary camps. The Teutonas, following similar migration patterns slightly later, added to the chaos and displacement throughout Gaul. Their movement through Belgic territories created direct military confrontations with several tribal groups, particularly the Eburones and Treveri, who controlled key river crossings and defensive positions along the invasion routes. These conflicts resulted in significant casualties and territorial adjustments that weakened traditional Belgic defensive arrangements. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ribemont-sur-Ancre reveals the material impact of these invasions on Belgic communities. Destruction layers dating to the late 2nd century BC contain evidence of burning, hasty burials, and the abandonment of valuable objects that suggest rapid evacuation under military pressure. Weapon deposits from this period show increased quantities of damaged arms and armour, indicating intensive combat operations and the ritual treatment of battlefield casualties. The invasions prompted significant population movements within Belgic territories as communities fled advancing Germanic forces or sought more defensible positions. Hill forts that had been abandoned or lightly occupied were rapidly refortified, while new defensive positions were constructed at strategic locations throughout the Confederation. These emergency fortifications typically featured hastily constructed earthworks, reinforced with timber palisades and deep ditches designed to slow advancing enemies. Defensive alliances formed during this crisis period created new political relationships that would influence Belgic Confederation structure for generations. Tribes that had previously maintained only loose connections were forced to coordinate military operations, share intelligence about enemy movements, and provide mutual support during siege operations. These wartime partnerships often evolved into permanent political arrangements that strengthened Confederation unity while altering traditional authority relationships. The Ambiani and Morini, controlling coastal territories, found themselves particularly vulnerable to Germanic raids launched from temporary bases along the Channel coast. Their response involved coordinating naval operations with British allies who provided ships and warriors to help defend channel crossings. These cross-channel military partnerships established precedents for later cooperation that would prove crucial during subsequent Roman invasion attempts. Roman military intervention against the Cimbri and Teutones, culminating in the victories of Marius at Aquae Sextiae and Vercellae in 102-101 BC, demonstrated Roman military capabilities to Belgic observers while creating new opportunities for diplomatic engagement. Marius's reforms of the Roman army, including the standardization of equipment and training procedures, produced military forces that operated with unprecedented efficiency and coordination. Belgic leaders who had witnessed Germanic military tactics during the invasions could appreciate the superior organization and equipment of Roman legions. Roman soldiers fought in disciplined formations using standardized weapons and armor, supported by sophisticated siege equipment and engineering capabilities that far exceeded anything available to Celtic or Germanic forces. The systematic nature of Roman military operations, from initial reconnaissance through final occupation of conquered territories, impressed even hostile observers. The establishment of Gallia Narbonensis in 118 BC had initially seemed distant from Belgic concerns, but the Germanic invasions demonstrated how quickly military situations could change throughout Gaul. Roman control of the Mediterranean coast provided secure bases for military operations, while generating substantial revenues that could fund further expansion. The province's prosperity, built on agricultural production, trade facilitation and resource extraction, offered a model for Roman provincial administration that would later be applied throughout Gaul. Roman administrative practices in Narbonensis differed significantly from the indirect rule systems that had characterized earlier Roman expansion in Italy and the Eastern Mediterranean. Provincial governors exercised direct authority over local communities, collected taxes through Roman officials rather than local intermediaries, and imposed Roman legal procedures for resolving disputes between different ethnic groups. These innovations created more efficient administration while reducing opportunities for local resistance. The economic benefits of Roman rule became apparent to Gallic communities within Narbonensis, as Roman investment in infrastructure, urban development, and agricultural improvement generated prosperity that exceeded pre-conquest levels. Roman engineers constructed roads, bridges, and harbour facilities that facilitated trade, while Roman merchants provided access to Mediterranean markets for local products. These material improvements influenced Gallic communities outside the province who observed the benefits of Roman association. Growing Roman influence throughout Gaul created increasing pressure on traditional Belgic autonomy and trade relationships. Roman merchants, backed by military power and legal protections unavailable to their competitors, began displacing Belgic traders in markets that had previously been dominated by Confederation members. Roman goods, manufactured with advanced techniques and available at competitive prices, undermined local craft production while creating dependency on Roman supply networks. The traditional Belgic role as intermediaries between Germanic territories and central Gaul became increasingly threatened as Roman influence expanded northward. Roman traders, operating under official protection and with access to superior transportation networks, could offer more reliable delivery and better prices than their Belgic competitors. This economic displacement threatened the prosperity that had supported Belgic political and military power throughout the Confederation. Roman diplomatic initiatives became more aggressive as military success against the Germanic invaders enhanced Roman prestige throughout Gaul. Roman envoys began demanding formal recognition of Roman authority, tribute payments, and military cooperation from tribes that had previously been treated as independent allies. These demands created internal conflicts within the Belgic Confederation as different leaders advocated varying responses to Roman pressure. The Remi, controlling territories along the Aisen Valley, emerged as early advocates for accommodation with Roman power. Their strategic position near the expanding Roman sphere made them vulnerable to military pressure while offering opportunities for profitable collaboration. Remi leaders argued that formal alliance with Rome would provide security against Germanic threats while maintaining internal autonomy under Roman protection. Opposition to Roman accommodation centred among the more distant tribes, particularly the Nervi and Eburones, who retained greater independence from Roman economic networks. These groups argued that Roman alliance would inevitably lead to loss of traditional freedoms and cultural practices that had defined Belgic identity for centuries. Their resistance was strengthened by successful defensive operations against Germanic raiders that demonstrated continued Belgic military effectiveness. Internal conflicts within individual tribes reflected broader Confederation debates about appropriate responses to Roman expansion. Younger warriors, influenced by accounts of Roman military efficiency and attracted by opportunities for service in Roman auxiliary forces, often supported closer ties with Rome. Older leaders, committed to traditional practices and suspicious of foreign influence, generally opposed accommodation with Roman authority. The rise of Germanic pressure from across the Rhine added another dimension to these political calculations. Germanic tribes, displaced by the earlier Cimbri and Teutones migrations, continued to probe Belgic defences while seeking new territories for settlement. The Suebi, under leaders like Ariovistus, established positions west of the Rhine that threatened traditional Belgic territories and trade routes. These Germanic pressures made Roman military support increasingly attractive to some Belgic leaders, while reinforcing others' determination to maintain independent defensive capabilities. Ariovistus's establishment of a Germanic kingdom in Sequani territory around 70 BC demonstrated the continued threat posed by trans-Rhenish populations. His forces, estimated at over 15,000 warriors, represented a permanent Germanic presence west of the Rhine that could serve as a base for further expansion into Belgic territories. The Sequani's inability to expel these Germanic settlers without Roman assistance illustrated the changing military balance in northern Gaul. Germanic military tactics evolved in response to their experiences during the Cimbri and Teutones migrations, incorporating lessons learned from conflicts with both Celtic and Roman forces. Germanic warriors began adopting improved weapons and armour, while developing new tactical formations that combined their traditional ferocity with greater discipline and coordination. These improvements made Germanic forces increasingly dangerous opponents for traditional Celtic military organisations. Belgic military responses to Germanic threats involved both tactical innovations and strategic adjustments that reflected changing conditions throughout Northern Europe. Belgic warriors began adopting heavier armour and longer weapons that proved more effective against Germanic fighting techniques. Cavalry forces, traditionally important in Belgic warfare, received enhanced equipment and training that improved their effectiveness in reconnaissance and pursuit operations. The Confederation's military organisation adapted to address the challenges posed by both Germanic raiders and potential Roman intervention. Traditional tribal levies were supplemented by professional warrior bands that could respond quickly to threats anywhere within Confederation territory. These professional forces received better equipment and training than militia units, while maintaining the cultural identity and fighting spirit that distinguished Belgic warriors from their enemies. Fortification construction accelerated throughout Belgic territories as leaders recognized the need for improved defensive positions. New hill forts incorporated lessons learned from Germanic siege techniques, while existing fortifications received upgrades that enhanced their ability to withstand prolonged attacks. These defensive improvements required substantial investments of labour and resources that strained Confederation finances while providing essential security for civilian populations. Trade relationships became increasingly militarized, as merchants required armed escorts to protect their goods from Germanic raiders and Roman tax collectors. Belgic merchant expeditions began resembling military operations, with substantial warrior contingents accompanying trade caravans throughout their journeys. These arrangements increased transportation costs while reducing profit margins for traditional trade goods. The shifting balance of power in Northern Gaul created opportunities for ambitious individuals to gain influence through successful adaptation to changing conditions. Some Belgic leaders enhanced their authority by negotiating favourable arrangements with Roman officials, while others gained prestige through successful military operations against Germanic raiders. These individual success stories influenced broader political developments within the Confederation as different approaches to external challenges proved their effectiveness. Religious practices evolved to address the spiritual challenges posed by foreign threats and cultural changes. Druids developed new rituals designed to protect Belgic communities from external dangers while maintaining traditional relationships with tribal deities. Sacred sites received enhanced fortifications and ritual deposits that reflected both defensive needs and spiritual requirements for divine protection. The material culture of this transitional period reflects the complex interplay of traditional practices, Roman influences, and Germanic pressures that characterized Belgic society during the early 1st century BC. Archaeological assemblages show selective adoption of foreign elements, combined with determined preservation of distinctive Belgic characteristics. This cultural synthesis would prove crucial for Confederation survival during the coming decades of intensified conflict and political transformation. The appointment of Gaius Julius Caesar as proconsul of Gallia Cisalpina and Gallia Narbonensis in 59 BC marked the beginning of the most decisive period in Belgic history, as Roman ambitions for territorial expansion collided directly with Confederation independence and traditional ways of life. Caesar's initial campaigns against the Helvetii in 58 BC demonstrated Roman military capabilities, while establishing forward bases that brought Roman forces uncomfortably close to Belgic territories. The systematic destruction of Helvetian resistance, accomplished through superior logistics, engineering expertise, and disciplined tactical formations, sent clear warnings to northern Gallic tribes about Roman intentions and capabilities. Belgic leaders observed these operations with growing alarm, recognizing that Roman expansion would inevitably threaten their own independence and territorial integrity. The strategic decision to confront the Belgic Confederation emerged from Caesar's assessment of the political and military situation in northern Gaul during the winter of 58-57 BC. Intelligence reports from Roman merchants, diplomatic contacts, and military reconnaissance indicated that Belgic tribes were actively coordinating defensive preparations and seeking alliances with Germanic groups across the Rhine. Caesar recognised that allowing the Belgae time to complete these preparations would create a formidable opponent capable of threatening Roman positions throughout Gaul. Caesar's famous declaration that of all the Gauls, the Belgae are the most courageous, reflected both genuine respect for Belgic military capabilities and calculated psychological warfare designed to justify the massive military resources he intended to deploy against them. This assessment, preserved in his commentary De Bello Gallico, acknowledged Belgic reputation for fierce resistance to foreign domination, while emphasizing the glory that would accrue to Roman forces who successfully conquered such formidable opponents. The statement also served domestic political purposes, enhancing Caesar's reputation for facing dangerous enemies rather than pursuing easy victories. Roman intelligence gathering throughout 58 BC had provided detailed information about Belgic military organization, territorial arrangements, and potential vulnerabilities. Roman merchants operating under military protection conducted systematic reconnaissance of Belgic settlements, fortifications, and supply networks while gathering information about tribal relationships and leadership structures. This intelligence revealed that the Confederation could potentially mobilize forces numbering over 300,000 warriors, representing the largest military challenge Rome had faced in Gaul. The Belgic response to Roman threats involved extensive diplomatic and military preparations that demonstrated the Confederation's organizational sophistication. Tribal leaders convened emergency assemblies throughout the winter of 57 BC, coordinating defensive strategies and establishing mutual support agreements that transcended traditional territorial boundaries. These preparations included standardizing weapons and equipment, establishing common supply depots, and developing communication systems that could coordinate operations across the Confederation's extensive territories. The Nervi assumed primary leadership of Confederation military planning, leveraging their central position, and established diplomatic relationships with other tribal groups. Their war chief, whose name remains unknown in historical sources, demonstrated exceptional strategic insight by recognizing that traditional Belgic tactics would require modification to address Roman military advantages. Nervian planners developed innovative approaches that combined traditional Celtic warrior culture with tactical adaptations designed to neutralize Roman superiority in engineering and formation fighting. Belgic military preparations involved mobilizing not only tribal warriors, but also allied forces from Germanic tribes across the Rhine who shared concerns about Roman expansion. The Cimbri and other Germanic groups provided cavalry units and specialized infantry forces that enhanced Belgic capabilities while demonstrating the international scope of resistance to Roman domination. These Germanic allies brought different fighting techniques and equipment that complemented traditional Belgic military strengths. Caesar's campaign preparations during the spring of 57 BC revealed the massive scale of Roman military commitment to Belgic conquest. 4 full legions, totaling approximately 24,000 heavy infantry, formed the core of Roman forces, supplemented by substantial auxiliary units drawn from recently conquered Gallic tribes. These auxiliary forces included Aeduan and Sequani cavalry units, Germanic infantry contingents, and specialized troops trained in siege warfare and engineering operations. Roman logistical arrangements for the Belgic campaign demonstrated the sophisticated supply systems that enabled sustained military operations far from Roman bases. Supply trains stretching for miles carried standardized equipment, weapons, food supplies, and engineering materials necessary for extended campaigning in hostile territory. Roman quartermasters had calculated supply requirements based on detailed intelligence about Belgic territories, seasonal conditions, and expected duration of military operations. The initial Roman advance into Belgic territory began in early spring 57 BC, with Caesar's forces moving northward from their winter quarters near modern Besancon. Roman engineers constructed temporary bridges across major rivers, while advanced scouts established communication networks that provided continuous intelligence about Belgic movements and defensive preparations. The systematic nature of Roman advancement contrasted sharply with traditional Celtic military practices, demonstrating Roman advantages in planning and coordination. Belgic initial responses to Roman invasion involved coordinated harassment operations designed to disrupt Roman supply lines, while avoiding major confrontations until Confederation forces could achieve numerical superiority. Small bands of Belgic warriors conducted raids against Roman foraging parties, attacked isolated outposts, and destroyed bridges and road improvements that facilitated Roman movement. These guerrilla tactics exploited Belgic advantages in local knowledge and mobility, while minimizing exposure to Roman tactical superiority in formal battle. The concentration of Belgic forces near the Aisne River represented the Confederation's strategic decision to force a decisive confrontation under conditions favourable to their military strengths. The selected position provided natural defensive advantages including river barriers, forested terrain that limited Roman cavalry operations, and elevated positions suitable for traditional Celtic charging tactics. Belgic leaders calculated that massed Confederation forces could overwhelm Roman formations through sheer numerical superiority and warrior ferocity. Roman reconnaissance of Belgic positions revealed the massive scale of Confederation military mobilization, while identifying potential tactical opportunities for Roman exploitation. Caesar's forces encountered Belgic advance guards numbering in the thousands, indicating main force strength that exceeded Roman intelligence estimates. These preliminary skirmishes demonstrated Belgic tactical improvements, including better coordination between different tribal contingents and more sophisticated use of terrain advantages. The Battle of the Sombra in 57 BC emerged from Roman attempts to establish forward positions that could support sustained operations against Belgic strongholds. Caesar's decision to cross the Sombra River near modern Maubeuge placed Roman forces in direct confrontation with the main Belgic army, which included substantial contingents from the Nervi, Atrebates and Viromandui. The battle would prove to be one of the most challenging military encounters of Caesar's entire Gallic campaigns. Belgic battle preparations revealed sophisticated tactical planning that incorporated lessons learned from previous encounters with Roman forces. The Nervi positioned their forces in dense forests that concealed their numbers while providing natural barriers against Roman cavalry charges. Atrebates' contingents occupied elevated positions that commanded river crossings, while Viromandui forces controlled supply routes that could threaten Roman communications with their bases in central Gaul. The distinctive battle formations employed by each Belgic tribe reflected their individual military traditions, while contributing to overall Confederation tactical effectiveness. Nervi warriors fought in dense infantry formations, using long swords and heavy spears, relying on disciplined charges that could break enemy lines through concentrated impact. Atrebates' forces specialized in cavalry operations and missile warfare, using javelins and slings to harass enemy formations before closing for hand-to-hand combat. Roman tactical deployment at the Samba demonstrated Caesar's adaptation of standard legionary procedures to address specific challenges posed by Belgic fighting techniques. Roman engineers constructed fortified camps with enhanced defensive works designed to protect against massive Belgic assaults. Legionary formations received modifications that provided greater flexibility in forest fighting, while maintaining the disciplined cohesion that gave Roman forces their tactical advantages. The initial phases of the Battle of the Samba nearly resulted in Roman defeat, as Belgic forces achieved tactical surprise through coordinated attacks that exploited weaknesses in Roman deployment. Nervii warriors launched devastating charges against Roman positions, while the legions were still establishing their battle formations. The ferocity and coordination of these attacks overwhelmed Roman advance guards and threatened to destroy entire legion formations before they could organize effective resistance. Roman accounts describe the battle's critical moments when Belgic warriors penetrated Roman defensive lines and engaged legionaries in close combat within their own fortified positions. The Nervii demonstrated exceptional courage by maintaining their attacks despite enormous casualties, with warriors continuing to fight even after suffering mortal wounds. Their determination to achieve victory regardless of personal cost exemplified the warrior culture that had earned Roman respect and fear. Caesar's personal intervention during the battle's climactic moments proved decisive in preventing complete Roman disaster. Contemporary accounts describe Caesar seizing a shield from a fallen soldier and personally leading counterattacks that restored Roman morale and tactical cohesion. His presence on the front lines inspired legionary resistance, while demonstrating Roman command leadership under extreme pressure. The turning point came when Roman tactical discipline and superior equipment began to overcome Belgic numerical advantages and initial surprise. Roman formations, once properly established, proved capable of withstanding Belgic charges while inflicting devastating casualties through coordinated javelin volleys and disciplined sword work. The systematic nature of Roman combat techniques gradually wore down Belgic resistance despite their continued fierce fighting. Belgic casualties at the Sambre reached catastrophic levels as Roman tactical advantages accumulated throughout the prolonged battle. The Nervii, who had led the Confederation's military efforts, suffered particularly severe losses among their warrior elite and tribal leadership. Contemporary estimates suggest that over 60,000 Belgic warriors died in the battle, representing a substantial portion of the Confederation's military strength and political leadership. The aftermath of the Sambre battle demonstrated both Roman military efficiency and Belgic cultural resilience in the face of devastating defeat. Roman forces systematically occupied Belgic territories, while Confederation survivors attempted to maintain organized resistance from fortified positions throughout their traditional lands. The scale of Belgic losses made continued large-scale resistance impossible, but individual tribal groups continued fighting using guerrilla tactics and defensive strategies. Roman systematic conquest of individual Belgic tribes following the Sambre victory revealed Caesar's strategic approach to consolidating territorial gains while preventing renewed Confederation unity. Rather than attempting to control all Belgic territories simultaneously, Roman forces concentrated on defeating individual tribal groups in sequence, preventing mutual support and coordinated resistance efforts. This approach maximized Roman tactical advantages while minimizing opportunities for Belgic recovery and reorganization. The campaign against the Aduatuci demonstrated Roman siege warfare capabilities against traditional Celtic fortifications. The Aduatuci, descendants of Cimbri settlers who had remained in Belgic territory after the earlier Germanic invasions, occupied a heavily fortified hilltop position that they believed impregnable to Roman attack. Their confidence in traditional defensive methods proved misplaced when confronted with Roman engineering expertise and systematic siege techniques. Roman siege operations against the Aduatuci stronghold incorporated advanced engineering methods that far exceeded anything previously seen in northern Gaul. Roman engineers constructed massive siege towers, battering rams, and catapults that could breach fortifications designed to resist traditional Celtic assault methods. The systematic approach to siege warfare, involving coordinated attacks from multiple directions supported by specialized equipment, demonstrated Roman technological superiority over traditional defensive practices. The Aduatuci initially attempted to negotiate surrender terms when they observed Roman siege preparations, recognizing that their fortifications could not withstand sustained assault by Roman engineering methods. However, their attempt to launch a surprise attack during surrender negotiations resulted in complete Roman victory and the enslavement of the entire tribal population. This outcome served as a warning to other Belgic groups about the consequences of continued resistance to Roman authority. The enslavement of the Aduatuci marked the final collapse of organised Belgic resistance, but the transformation from independent confederation to Roman province required far more complex processes than military conquest alone could achieve. The systematic integration of Belgic territories into the Roman administrative framework began immediately after Caesar's victories, involving the careful restructuring of political institutions, economic systems, and social hierarchies that had governed these lands for centuries. Roman administrators faced the enormous challenge of transforming a collection of tribal territories into functioning components of the imperial system while maintaining sufficient stability to prevent renewed rebellion. The creation of Gallia Belgica as a distinct administrative province occurred gradually between 50 and 27 BC, as Roman officials developed governance structures appropriate to the region's unique characteristics. Unlike the Mediterranean provinces where Roman rule could build upon existing urban centres and established administrative traditions, Belgic territories required fundamental reorganisation of settlement patterns and political institutions. The province initially encompassed territories from the Seine River in the south to the Rhine frontier in the north, including lands formerly controlled by the Nervii, Ambiani, Atrebates, Morini, and numerous smaller tribal groups. Roman territorial organisation divided former Belgic lands into civitates that preserved tribal identities while subordinating them to imperial authority. The Civitas Nerviorum, centred at Beauvais, encompassed traditional Nervi territories along the Sambre and Meuse valleys. Roman surveyors established precise boundaries using natural features and artificial markers, creating defined administrative units that replaced the fluid territorial arrangements characteristic of Celtic political organisation. These civitates served as the basic units of provincial administration, responsible for tax collection, military recruitment, and local governance under Roman supervision. The establishment of coloniae represented the most direct form of Roman settlement within former Belgic territories. Colonia Claudia Ara Agrippinensium, founded around 38 AD near the Rhine frontier, became the provincial capital and demonstrated Roman urban planning principles applied to northern European conditions. The colony's grid street system, forum complex, and public buildings followed standardized Roman architectural models while incorporating practical adaptations for local climate and building materials. Veteran legionaries received land grants in the colony's territory, creating a loyal Roman population that could serve as a stabilizing influence in the frontier region. Municipal development in existing Belgic settlements required extensive reconstruction that transformed traditional oppida into Roman-style towns. Amiens, the former Ambiani stronghold, received substantial Roman investment in infrastructure, including paved roads, aqueduct systems, and public baths that served both practical and symbolic purposes. The transformation involved demolishing traditional Celtic fortifications and replacing them with Roman-style walls that emphasized civic pride rather than military defense. Public spaces received monumental architecture, including temples, basilicas, and theatres that provided venues for Roman civic rituals and cultural activities. The imposition of Roman law throughout Belgic territories required fundamental changes in legal procedures and social relationships that had governed Celtic communities for generations. Roman legal principles based on written statutes and formal court procedures replaced traditional Celtic justice systems that relied on oral traditions and personal relationships between disputants and arbitrators. The establishment of Roman courts in major settlements provided venues for resolving disputes according to imperial legal standards, while Roman magistrates assumed judicial responsibilities previously exercised by druids and tribal leaders. Property law underwent particularly significant transformation as Roman concepts of individual ownership replaced Celtic traditions of communal land tenure and kinship-based resource rights. Roman surveyors conducted systematic land assessments that established individual property boundaries and created written records of ownership that could be enforced through imperial legal mechanisms. These changes affected not only agricultural lands, but also mineral rights, water access, and forest resources that had traditionally been managed through tribal consensus and customary arrangements. Marriage and family law experienced substantial modification as Roman legal principles superseded Celtic customs regarding kinship relationships, inheritance rights, and social obligations. Roman marriage contracts replaced Celtic hand-fasting ceremonies, while Roman inheritance law determined property transfers between generations according to imperial legal standards rather than tribal traditions. These changes particularly affected elite families whose political and economic positions depended on traditional kinship networks and hereditary privileges that Roman law did not recognize. Urban planning in Romanized Belgic settlements followed standardized principles that created familiar environments for Roman administrators and merchants while demonstrating imperial power to local populations. The Forum complex at Belgae, constructed during the Flavian period, included a basilica measuring over 100 metres in length, surrounded by porticos that provided covered walkways and commercial spaces. The complex's monumental architecture, featuring imported marble columns and elaborate decorative sculpture, created an impressive civic centre that rivaled facilities in more established Roman cities. Residential architecture evolved to accommodate Roman domestic practices while adapting to local environmental conditions and available building materials. Elite residences in Romanized Belgic towns featured atrium-style courtyards, elaborate mosaic floors, and hypocaust heating systems that provided comfortable living conditions during northern European winters. These houses incorporated Roman architectural elements including painted wall decorations, marble architectural details, and sophisticated plumbing systems that demonstrated their owners' adoption of Roman lifestyle preferences. The development of villa rustica estates throughout former Belgic territories represented one of the most significant economic transformations of the early imperial period. These agricultural complexes combined Roman agricultural techniques with existing Celtic farming knowledge to create highly productive estates that supplied urban markets and supported substantial rural populations. The villa at Anthe, constructed during the 1st century AD, included residential quarters for the estate owner and his family, workshops for agricultural processing, and accommodation for farm workers and slaves who provided necessary labour. Roman agricultural innovations introduced new crops, farming techniques, and livestock management practices that increased productivity while integrating Belgic territories into imperial economic networks. The cultivation of wine grapes in the Moselle Valley, initiated during the 1st century AD, created new agricultural opportunities while providing products that commanded high prices in Roman markets. Roman agricultural writers like Columella provided technical guidance for estate management, crop rotation, and livestock breeding that Belgic landowners adapted to local conditions and market opportunities. Road construction represented perhaps the most visible symbol of Roman transformation throughout former Belgic territories. The Via Agrippa, constructed during Augustus's reign, connected the Rhine frontier with central Gaul through a network of paved highways that facilitated military movement, commercial transport, and administrative communication. These roads featured standardized construction techniques, including layered stone foundations, cambered surfaces for drainage, and regular spacing of way stations that provided accommodation and supplies for travelers. The road system's impact extended far beyond transportation efficiency to encompass fundamental changes in settlement patterns, economic relationships, and cultural exchange throughout the region. Towns developed at major road junctions became commercial centres that attracted merchants, craftsmen, and service providers who created thriving urban economies. The predictable travel times and secure transportation provided by Roman roads enabled long-distance trade relationships that connected Belgic producers with markets throughout the empire. Military recruitment from Belgic populations began immediately after conquest and continued throughout the early imperial period, providing opportunities for social advancement while serving Roman strategic interests. Belgic warriors, renowned for their courage and fighting skills, became valued members of auxiliary units that served throughout the empire. The Ala Belgica and Cohors Belgarum fought in Britain, Germania, and along the Danube frontier, gaining citizenship rights and military honours that elevated their social status upon completion of service. Veterans returning to Belgic territories after military service brought Roman cultural practices, technical knowledge, and social connections that facilitated ongoing Romanization processes. These men often received land grants, or established businesses that provided models for Roman lifestyle adoption, while creating networks of Roman influence throughout rural areas. Their experiences in other parts of the empire provided valuable knowledge about Roman administrative practices, commercial opportunities, and cultural expectations that proved essential for successful integration into imperial society. Taxation systems imposed throughout Gallia Belgica required fundamental changes in economic organization and agricultural production that affected every level of society. The tributum soli, levied on agricultural land according to Roman assessment procedures, replaced traditional Celtic tribute systems based on personal relationships and reciprocal obligations. Roman tax collectors, supported by detailed land surveys and written records, systematically assessed and collected revenues that funded provincial administration, military garrisons, and public works projects. Commercial taxation, including customs duties and market fees, created new sources of imperial revenue while regulating trade relationships that had previously operated through informal arrangements. Roman tax farmers, operating under imperial contracts, established collection systems that monitored commercial transactions and ensured regular revenue flows to imperial treasuries. These arrangements created opportunities for profit among Roman merchants and their local partners, while imposing new costs on traditional trading relationships. Religious transformation throughout former Belgic territories involved complex processes of syncretism that blended Celtic traditions with Roman religious practices while gradually introducing new spiritual concepts. Traditional Celtic deities received Roman names and attributes that made them acceptable within imperial religious frameworks, while preserving essential characteristics that maintained their appeal to local populations. Epona, the Celtic horse goddess, became associated with Roman cavalry units and received official recognition throughout the empire, while Teutotes merged with Mars to create Mars Teutotes, a deity that combined Roman military associations with Celtic tribal protector functions. Temple construction in Romanized Belgic settlements provided venues for religious activities that combined Roman architectural forms with Celtic spiritual practices. The temple complex at Ribemont-sur-Ancre, reconstructed during the 1st century AD, featured a Romano-Celtic temple design with a central cella surrounded by an ambulatory that accommodated both Roman sacrificial rituals and Celtic processional ceremonies. The complex included facilities for ritual feasting, votive offerings, and seasonal celebrations that maintained community, religious traditions within Roman architectural frameworks. The decline of Druidism occurred gradually throughout the early imperial period, as Roman authorities systematically undermined Druidical authority while providing alternative sources for legal, educational, and spiritual guidance. Imperial edicts prohibiting human sacrifice and limiting Druidical legal jurisdiction reduced Druids' traditional roles, while Roman schools and courts provided replacement institutions that served similar social functions. Some Druids adapted to Roman rule by becoming teachers, legal advisors, or religious officials who operated within imperial institutional frameworks. Archaeological evidence from religious sites throughout former Belgic territories reveals the material impact of religious transformation during the early imperial period. Votive deposits in springs and rivers show gradual changes in offering types, with Roman coins and manufactured goods supplementing traditional weapons and personal ornaments. The standardization of votive practices, including the use of Latin inscriptions and Roman religious formulae, demonstrates growing integration into imperial religious networks while maintaining essential characteristics of Celtic spiritual traditions. The gradual introduction of Christianity into Belgic territories occurred primarily through commercial and administrative networks that connected provincial communities with Christian centres in other parts of the empire. Early Christian communities established in major towns like Reims and Trier during the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD initially attracted primarily urban populations who had already experienced substantial Romanization. These communities operated within existing Roman religious frameworks while developing distinctive practices that would eventually transform regional spiritual life. Educational systems established in Romanized Belgic settlements provided instruction in Latin language, Roman literature, and imperial administrative procedures that prepared local elites for participation in provincial governance. Schools in major towns offered curricula based on Roman educational models, including rhetoric, law, and philosophy that enabled students to pursue careers in imperial service. These educational opportunities created new pathways for social advancement, while ensuring that local leadership possessed the knowledge and skills necessary for effective collaboration with Roman authorities. The transformation of material culture throughout former Belgic territories reflected broader processes of cultural integration that affected daily life, social relationships, and personal identity. Pottery production shifted toward Roman forms and decorative styles, while traditional Celtic designs gradually disappeared from common use. Terra sigillata vessels, manufactured in Gallic workshops using Roman techniques, replaced handmade Celtic pottery in elite contexts while demonstrating successful technology transfer and market integration. Metalworking traditions adapted to Roman demands for standardized products while maintaining technical expertise that had characterized Celtic craftsmanship for centuries. Belgic smiths produced Roman-style weapons and tools for military and civilian markets, while developing new products that combined Roman functional requirements with local aesthetic preferences. The workshops at Belgae produced bronze vessels, iron tools, and decorative objects that supplied regional markets, while demonstrating successful adaptation to Roman commercial networks. Textile production underwent significant transformation as Roman clothing styles and fabric preferences influenced local manufacturing practices. The adoption of Roman dress, including togas for formal occasions and Roman-style tunics for daily wear, required new weaving techniques and fabric types that differed significantly from traditional Celtic textiles. Archaeological evidence from sites like Tongeren reveals specialized textile workshops that produced both Roman-style garments and traditional Celtic clothing for different market segments. The transformation of material culture throughout former Belgic territories reflected broader processes of cultural integration that affected daily life, social relationships, and personal identity. By 100 AD, these changes had created the foundation for an unprecedented period of prosperity and urban development that would define the region for the next century and a half. The systematic integration of Belgic lands into imperial economic networks, combined with strategic investments in infrastructure and urban planning, generated wealth and cultural achievements that rivaled the most prosperous provinces of the Roman Empire. Augusta Treverorum emerged as the crown jewel of Belgic urban development during the early 2nd century AD. The city's strategic position along the Moselle River, combined with its proximity to the Rhine frontier, made it an essential administrative centre for imperial operations throughout northern Gaul and Germania. Roman engineers transformed the modest Treveri settlement into a monumental urban complex that demonstrated imperial architectural ambitions adapted to northern European conditions. The city's grid street system, laid out according to standardized Roman planning principles, encompassed over 285 hectares within its defensive walls, making it one of the largest cities north of the Alps. The Porta Nigra, constructed during the reign of Marcus Aurelius, exemplified the monumental architecture that characterized Augusta Trevororum's development. This massive sandstone gateway, rising to a height of 30 meters, featured 4 stories of arcaded galleries supported by engaged columns that created dramatic light and shadow effects across its facade. The structure's defensive capabilities were secondary to its symbolic function as a demonstration of imperial power and urban sophistication. Local quarries provided the distinctive grey sandstone that gave the gate its name, while Roman engineers employed advanced lifting techniques and precise masonry work that ensured structural stability for centuries. The imperial baths complex at Augusta Treverorum, covering an area of approximately 42,000 square meters, represented the largest bathing facility north of Rome and demonstrated the city's importance within imperial hierarchy. The complex included multiple bathing pools maintained at different temperatures, exercise areas for athletic activities, libraries for intellectual pursuits, and gardens that provided peaceful settings for social interaction. The hypocaust heating system, supplied by massive furnaces that consumed tons of wood daily, maintained comfortable temperatures throughout the complex even during harsh winter conditions. Elaborate mosaic floors depicted mythological scenes and geometric patterns that rivaled the finest decorative work found in Mediterranean cities. Administrative buildings within Augusta Treverorum reflected the city's role as a regional capital responsible for governing extensive territories along the Rhine frontier. The basilica, measuring 67 meters in length and 27 meters in width, provided a venue for legal proceedings, commercial transactions, and civic ceremonies that attracted visitors from throughout the province. The building's interior featured soaring columns that supported a coffered ceiling decorated with painted designs that celebrated imperial achievements and local prosperity. Adjacent offices housed the extensive bureaucracy required for provincial administration, including tax collection, military recruitment, and judicial proceedings. Duracotorum, the civitas capital of the former Remi territory, experienced equally impressive development during the 2nd century AD, as Roman investment transformed it into a major commercial and administrative centre. The city's position along the Via Agrippa made it a crucial transportation hub that connected the Rhine frontier with central Gaul and the Mediterranean provinces. Roman urban planners expanded the original Remi settlement to encompass over 600 hectares, creating one of the largest urban areas in northern Gaul through systematic development that incorporated both Roman architectural principles and adaptations to local environmental conditions. The Forum complex at Duracotorum demonstrated the successful integration of Roman civic architecture with regional building traditions and materials. The central square, measuring 140 by 115 meters, was surrounded by porticos that provided covered walkways and commercial spaces for merchants and craftsmen. Local limestone, quarried from deposits near the city, provided building material for columns and decorative elements that gave the complex its distinctive appearance. The basilica that dominated the forum's northern side featured an apse decorated with marble veneer imported from Mediterranean quarries, demonstrating the city's participation in empire-wide trade networks. Commercial districts within Duracotorum reflected the city's role as a manufacturing and trading centre that supplied markets throughout northern Gaul. Pottery workshops concentrated in the eastern quarter produced terra sigillata vessels, cooking pots, and storage jars that combined Roman forms with local decorative traditions. Archaeological excavations have revealed workshop areas with multiple kilns, clay preparation facilities, and storage areas that indicate large-scale production for regional distribution. The workshops employed both free craftsmen and slave labourers who possessed the technical skills necessary for producing high-quality ceramic goods that competed successfully with imports from other Gallic production centres. Textile manufacturing in Duraquartrum capitalized on the region's sheep-raising traditions while adapting to Roman market demands for standardized products. Workshops concentrated near the river processed wool through fulling, dyeing and finishing operations that produced cloth suitable for both military and civilian markets. The adoption of Roman dyeing techniques, using imported materials like cochineal and murex, enabled local manufacturers to produce textiles with colours and patterns that appealed to Romanized consumers throughout the province. Finished textiles were distributed through commercial networks that extended from Britain to the Rhine frontier, generating substantial profits for workshop owners and their investors. Belgae, the administrative centre of the former Nervii territory, underwent extensive reconstruction during the Flavian period that transformed it from a modest tribal settlement into a thriving Roman town. The city's location at the intersection of major roads connecting the Channel coast with the Rhine frontier made it an essential link in imperial transportation and communication networks. Roman engineers constructed an aqueduct system that supplied clean water from springs located 15 kilometres from the city, demonstrating the substantial investment required to support urban development in regions lacking natural water sources. The amphitheatre at Belgae, capable of accommodating approximately 6,000 spectators, provided a venue for gladiatorial games, animal hunts and public executions that served both entertainment and political functions. The structure's elliptical arena, measuring 50 by 40 metres, was surrounded by tiered seating constructed from local stone and timber. Underground chambers beneath the arena floor housed wild animals, gladiators and mechanical equipment used in spectacles that demonstrated Roman cultural values and imperial power to audiences drawn from throughout the Civitas territory. The amphitheatre's construction required substantial financial resources and technical expertise that indicated Belgae's prosperity and administrative importance within the provincial hierarchy. Residential architecture in Belgae reflected the successful adaptation of Roman domestic practices to Northern European environmental conditions and available building materials. Elite houses featured central courtyards surrounded by rooms that served specific functions, including dining, sleeping and storage. Hypercaust heating systems, supplied by furnaces that burned local wood and charcoal, provided comfortable living conditions during winter months when temperatures regularly dropped below freezing. Wall paintings and mosaic floors decorated the most important rooms, while gardens and fountains created pleasant outdoor spaces that could be enjoyed during warmer seasons. The economic prosperity that supported urban development throughout former Belgic territories rested on diversified agricultural production that combined traditional Celtic farming knowledge with Roman technical innovations and market organisation. Large villa estates, established throughout the fertile river valleys, employed both free tenant farmers and slave labourers in agricultural operations that produced grain, livestock and specialty crops for urban and military markets. The villa at Echternach, covering over 4,000 hectares, included residential quarters for the estate owner, workshops for processing agricultural products, and accommodation for the substantial workforce required for large-scale farming operations. Wine production in the Moselle Valley represented one of the most successful agricultural innovations of the imperial period, as Roman viticulture techniques were adapted to northern European growing conditions. Vineyards established during the 2nd century AD produced wines that gained recognition throughout the empire for their quality and distinctive characteristics. The poet Ausonius, writing in the 4th century, praised Moselle wines for their clarity and flavour, comparing them favourably with the finest Italian vintages. Wine production required substantial initial investments in vineyard preparation, specialised equipment, and skilled labourers, but successful estates generated enormous profits that funded urban construction projects and luxury imports. Pottery production throughout the region evolved into a major industry that supplied markets from Britain to the Danube frontier. The workshops at Rheinzabern, though technically outside Belgic territory, provided a model for similar operations established at sites like Trier and Belgae. These workshops produced standardized terra sigillata vessels using molds that ensured consistent quality and appearance. Decorative motifs combined Roman mythological themes with Celtic artistic traditions, creating products that appealed to diverse consumer preferences throughout the empire. The workshops employed hundreds of workers, including potters, decorators, and support staff who created thriving industrial communities. Iron production and metalworking continued to play crucial roles in the regional economy, as Belgic territories contained extensive ore deposits and possessed well-established traditions of metallurgical expertise. The workshops at Belgae produced tools, weapons, and household items that supplied both civilian and military markets. Roman technical innovations, including improved furnace designs and standardized production techniques, increased productivity while maintaining the high quality that had characterized Celtic metalwork for centuries. Specialized craftsmen produced luxury items including bronze vessels, jewelry, and decorative fittings that demonstrated the continuation of artistic traditions within Roman commercial frameworks. Trans-European trade networks centered on major Belgic cities facilitated the movement of goods, people, and ideas that connected the region with markets throughout the Roman world. Merchants based in Augusta Treverorum maintained commercial relationships with suppliers in Britain, Germania, and the Mediterranean provinces, importing luxury goods while exporting regional products that commanded premium prices in distant markets. The Rhine River provided a crucial transportation artery that enabled bulk shipments of grain, pottery, and manufactured goods to reach markets along the frontier and in the interior provinces. Commercial law and banking systems established in major Belgic cities provided the institutional framework necessary for complex trade relationships that spanned multiple provinces and involved diverse currencies and legal systems. Roman legal principles governing contracts, property rights, and dispute resolution enabled merchants to conduct business with confidence while providing mechanisms for enforcing agreements across vast distances. Banking houses, often operated by freedmen with connections to Italian financial networks, provided credit facilities and currency exchange services that facilitated international commerce. The strategic position of Belgic territories along the Rhine frontier made them essential components of imperial military organisation throughout the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD. Legionary fortresses at sites like Bonn and Cologne required substantial supply networks that drew resources from throughout the region while providing markets for local producers. Military contracts for grain, meat, leather goods, and manufactured items generated steady demand that supported agricultural and industrial development throughout the province. The presence of substantial military forces also created markets for luxury goods and services that attracted merchants and craftsmen from throughout the empire. Auxiliary units recruited from Romanized Belgic populations served throughout the empire while maintaining connections with their homeland communities. Veterans returning after completing military service brought wealth, technical knowledge, and cultural experiences that enriched their home communities while providing models for successful integration into imperial society. These men often invested their savings in land, commercial enterprises, or urban properties that contributed to regional prosperity while creating networks of influence that facilitated ongoing Romanization processes. Cultural achievements during this period reflected the successful synthesis of Celtic traditions with Roman educational and artistic practices. Schools established in major cities provided instruction in Latin literature, rhetoric, and philosophy that prepared students for careers in imperial service, while preserving elements of local cultural identity. The poet Ausonius, born in Bordeaux but educated in Trier, exemplified the intellectual achievements possible within provincial cultural frameworks that combined classical learning with regional perspectives and experiences. Gallo-Roman art developed distinctive characteristics that reflected the successful integration of Celtic artistic traditions with Roman technical methods and aesthetic principles. Sculptural workshops in major cities produced portrait statues, relief carvings, and decorative architectural elements that combined Roman iconographic programs with Celtic stylistic preferences. The Jupiter column at Mainz, though outside core Belgic territory, demonstrated the monumental sculpture possible when Celtic artistic imagination was combined with Roman technical capabilities and financial resources. Educational institutions established in Belgic cities attracted students from throughout northern Gaul and Germania, creating intellectual centres that rivaled the schools of southern Gaul and Italy. The law school at Beirut drew students from Augusta Treverorum, who returned to practice in provincial courts, while medical schools provided training that improved healthcare throughout the region. These educational opportunities created career paths for ambitious young men, while ensuring that provincial administration possessed the skilled personnel necessary for effective governance. Literary production in Belgic territories included both Latin works that participated in empire-wide intellectual discourse and vernacular compositions that preserved Celtic cultural traditions within Roman literary frameworks. Historical works, legal commentaries, and philosophical treatises produced by provincial authors contributed to imperial intellectual life while reflecting regional perspectives and concerns. The preservation of Celtic mythological traditions within Latin literary forms ensured cultural continuity while demonstrating successful adaptation to Roman educational and cultural standards. Religious syncretism reached sophisticated levels during this period, as Celtic deities received elaborate temple complexes that combined Roman architectural forms with traditional Celtic ritual practices. However, the stability and prosperity that had characterized Belgic territories throughout the 2nd century AD began to unravel during the middle decades of the 3rd century, as a cascade of military, economic, and political crises fundamentally disrupted the imperial system that had governed these lands for over 2 centuries. The crisis of the 3rd century, as modern historians term this turbulent period, subjected former Belgic territories to unprecedented pressures that tested the resilience of Romano-Celtic society and ultimately transformed the region's political, economic, and cultural foundations. The first major disruption came through intensified barbarian pressure along the Rhine frontier as Germanic tribes, themselves displaced by population movements further east, began launching increasingly aggressive raids into Roman territory. The Alemanni, a confederation of Germanic tribes that had coalesced during the early 3rd century, proved particularly threatening to Belgic territories due to their sophisticated military organisation and strategic coordination. Unlike earlier Germanic incursions that had consisted primarily of opportunistic raids, Alemannic operations demonstrated systematic planning and long-term territorial objectives that posed existential threats to Roman control of the region. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Rhine frontier reveals the material impact of these Germanic incursions on civilian populations throughout former Belgic territories. Coin hoards buried during the 250s and 260s AD, discovered at locations from Tongeren to Beauvais, contain substantial quantities of silver and bronze coins that their owners never returned to retrieve. The systematic pattern of these deposits, concentrated in rural areas and smaller towns, suggests widespread population displacement as residents fled advancing Germanic forces. Destruction layers at villa sites near the frontier contain evidence of burning, hasty abandonment, and the deliberate concealment of valuable objects that their owners hoped to recover after the danger had passed. The economic disruption caused by constant military threats extended far beyond immediate frontier zones to affect commercial networks and agricultural production throughout the region. Trade routes that had connected Belgic territories with markets throughout the empire became increasingly dangerous and unreliable as Germanic raiders targeted merchant caravans and river transport. The Via Agrippa, which had served as the backbone of regional commerce for over 2 centuries, required constant military escorts that increased transportation costs while reducing the volume of goods that could be moved efficiently. Many merchants abandoned long-distance trade entirely, focusing instead on local markets that offered greater security despite reduced profit margins. Agricultural production suffered severely as villa estates near the frontier were abandoned or destroyed by Germanic raids. The sophisticated agricultural systems that had supported urban populations and generated export surpluses could not function effectively under constant military threat. Estate owners who had invested substantial resources in vineyard development, specialized livestock breeding, and agricultural processing facilities found their investments worthless, as security conditions made normal farming operations impossible. Many estates were abandoned permanently, with their lands reverting to forest or becoming the domain of Germanic settlers who established their own agricultural communities using different techniques and organizational methods. Urban centres throughout former Belgic territories experienced population decline and economic contraction as the prosperity of the previous century gave way to uncertainty and hardship. Augusta Treverorum, despite its strategic importance as an administrative centre, saw substantial portions of its population flee to more secure locations in the interior of Gaul. Archaeological evidence from residential districts shows the abandonment of elaborate private houses and the conversion of public buildings to defensive purposes. The magnificent bath complexes that had symbolized urban sophistication were partially demolished to provide building materials for hastily constructed fortifications that reflected the changed priorities of urban survival. The breakdown of imperial authority created opportunities for ambitious individuals to establish independent power bases that challenged traditional Roman governance structures. Military commanders, faced with irregular pay and inadequate supplies from imperial sources, began relying on local resources and developing personal loyalty relationships with their troops that superseded formal imperial command structures. These arrangements, while providing short-term military effectiveness, undermined the systematic administration that had characterized Roman rule throughout the region for generations. Local aristocrats whose wealth and status had depended on their integration into imperial administrative networks found themselves forced to adapt to rapidly changing political circumstances. Some maintained their positions by collaborating with Germanic leaders who established control over particular territories, while others fled to more secure regions where they could preserve their wealth and social status. The traditional Roman villa lifestyle became increasingly untenable as the economic and security conditions that had supported it disappeared throughout much of the region. The emergence of the Gallic Empire in 260 AD represented the most dramatic political transformation in Belgic territories since Caesar's original conquest 3 centuries earlier. Postumus, a Roman military commander of probable Belgic origin, established an independent state that encompassed Gaul, Britain, and parts of Germania in direct defiance of imperial authority. This breakaway empire, which would persist for 14 years, provided former Belgic territories with a degree of political stability and military security that the legitimate imperial government had proven unable to maintain during the crisis period. Postumus established his capital at Augusta Treverorum, recognizing the city's strategic position and administrative infrastructure as ideal for governing his extensive territories. The choice reflected both practical considerations and symbolic significance, as the former Treveri capital became the centre of a new political entity that claimed legitimacy as the true heir of Roman authority in northwestern Europe. The Gallic Empire's administrative structure preserved Roman governmental forms while adapting them to the specific needs of territories that had been effectively abandoned by the central imperial government. The military organisation of the Gallic Empire drew heavily on Belgic populations who had maintained their reputation as exceptional warriors throughout the imperial period. Auxiliary units that had previously served on distant frontiers were recalled to defend their homeland territories, while new military formations were created from local recruits who possessed intimate knowledge of regional terrain and conditions. These forces proved remarkably effective in defending Gallic Empire territories against both Germanic incursions and attempts by legitimate imperial forces to restore central authority. Economic policies implemented by the Gallic Empire reflected the practical needs of territories that had been cut off from traditional Mediterranean trade networks and imperial financial systems. Local mints established at sites including Augusta Treverorum and Colonia Claudia. Ara Agrippinensium produced silver and bronze coins that maintained Roman iconographic traditions while asserting the independent authority of Gallic rulers. These coins, found throughout former Belgic territories, demonstrate the Gallic Empire's success in maintaining monetary systems and commercial relationships despite its separation from imperial financial networks. The Gallic Empire's approach to territorial defence involved systematic fortification of strategic positions and the establishment of defensive networks that could coordinate responses to external threats. Existing Roman fortifications received upgrades and modifications that enhanced their defensive capabilities, while new strongholds were constructed at locations that controlled important river crossings and road junctions. These defensive improvements reflected both Germanic military innovations and traditional Celtic fortification techniques, creating hybrid defensive systems that proved remarkably effective against various types of attacks. Cultural policies within the Gallic Empire demonstrated efforts to maintain Roman civilization, while acknowledging the practical realities of governing territories that had experienced substantial disruption and population change. Educational institutions in major cities continued operating despite reduced resources, while public building projects maintained urban infrastructure and provided employment for displaced populations. The Gallic Empire's rulers recognized that maintaining civilian morale and cultural continuity was essential for long-term political stability in territories that had experienced traumatic disruption. The collapse of the Gallic Empire in 274 AD, achieved through the military campaigns of Aurelian, marked the beginning of another period of adjustment and transformation for former Belgic territories. Imperial reconquest involved substantial military operations that caused additional destruction and population displacement, while the restoration of central authority required extensive administrative reorganization. The territories that had enjoyed relative stability under Gallic Empire rule now faced the challenge of reintegration into an imperial system that had itself undergone significant changes during the period of separation. Aurelian's victory over Tetricus, the last Gallic emperor, was achieved through systematic military campaigns that demonstrated the restored strength of imperial forces while revealing the exhaustion of Gallic resistance. The Battle of Chalons, fought in 274 AD, saw the defeat of the last organised Gallic army and the capture of Tetricus himself. However, the imperial victory came at considerable cost, as the military operations required to restore central authority caused additional destruction to territories that had already suffered extensively during previous conflicts. The administrative reforms implemented by Diocletian after 284 AD represented the most comprehensive reorganization of former Belgic territories since their original incorporation into the Roman Empire. The creation of Belgica Prima and Belgica Secunda as separate administrative units reflected both practical governance considerations and recognition that the region's strategic importance required specialized administrative arrangements. These new provinces, carved from the original Gallia Belgica, possessed distinct characteristics and faced different challenges that required tailored administrative approaches. Belgica Prima, with its capital at Augusta Treverorum, encompassed the eastern portions of former Belgic territory, including the crucial Rhine frontier regions. The province's strategic importance as a barrier against Germanic incursions made it a priority for imperial military investment and administrative attention. Diocletian's reforms provided Belgica Prima with enhanced military resources and administrative autonomy that enabled more effective responses to regional security challenges while maintaining integration with broader imperial systems. Belgica Secunda centred at Duracourtorum, included the western portions of former Belgic territory and maintained closer connections with Central Gaul and the Channel regions. The province's agricultural resources and commercial networks made it valuable for supporting military operations while generating revenues that funded imperial administration throughout the region. The division of responsibilities between the two Belgic provinces created more manageable administrative units while preserving essential coordination mechanisms for addressing common challenges. The tetrarchic system established by Diocletian provided former Belgic territories with more direct imperial attention than they had received since the early imperial period. Constantius Chlorus, appointed as Caesar for the Western territories, established his residence at Augusta Treverorum and took personal responsibility for addressing the region's military and administrative challenges. His presence provided local populations with direct access to imperial authority, while ensuring that regional concerns received appropriate attention within broader imperial policy deliberations. Military reforms implemented throughout the Tetrarchic period transformed defensive arrangements in former Belgic territories through the establishment of new fortifications, the reorganization of military units, and the development of more flexible response capabilities. The construction of fortified positions along the Rhine frontier created a defensive network that could coordinate responses to Germanic threats while providing secure bases for offensive operations when circumstances permitted. These fortifications incorporated lessons learned from previous conflicts while adapting to changing military technologies and tactical requirements. The Limitanei, frontier troops assigned to permanent positions along the Rhine, developed close relationships with local civilian populations that created new forms of military-civilian cooperation. These soldiers, often recruited from regional populations, possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions and maintained family connections that enhanced their commitment to territorial defense. The integration of military and civilian communities created resilient defensive systems that could function effectively even when formal imperial support was interrupted. The rise of Christianity throughout former Belgic territories during the late 3rd and early 4th centuries represented one of the most significant cultural transformations in the region's history. Christian communities, initially concentrated in major urban centres, began expanding into rural areas where they encountered and gradually displaced traditional Romano-Celtic religious practices. The establishment of episcopal sees in cities like Augusta Treverorum, Duracourtorum and Bagacum provided institutional frameworks for Christian expansion while creating new sources of spiritual and social authority that competed with traditional Roman civic institutions. The conversion process involved complex negotiations between Christian teachings and established religious traditions that had sustained regional communities for centuries. Christian missionaries and bishops demonstrated remarkable flexibility in adapting their message to local cultural contexts while maintaining essential theological principles. Sacred sites that had served Celtic and Romano-Celtic religious purposes were often converted to Christian use, with churches constructed on locations that already possessed spiritual significance for local populations. Archaeological evidence from Christian sites throughout the region reveals the material culture of religious transformation during this period. Early Christian churches, constructed using local building materials and techniques, incorporated architectural elements that reflected both Roman building traditions and practical adaptations to Northern European environmental conditions. Burial practices evolved to reflect Christian beliefs about death and resurrection, while maintaining certain traditional elements that provided cultural continuity for converted populations. The establishment of monastic communities throughout former Belgic territories created new centres of learning and cultural preservation that would prove crucial for maintaining civilization during subsequent periods of political instability. However, these religious institutions would soon face unprecedented challenges as the collapse of effective imperial control in the Western territories opened former Belgic lands to large-scale barbarian settlement and political reorganization. The 5th century witnessed the most dramatic transformation of these territories since Caesar's original conquest, as Germanic tribes established permanent kingdoms that fundamentally altered the region's demographic composition, political structures, and cultural identity. The Salian Franks emerged as the most significant Germanic group to establish lasting control over substantial portions of former Belgic territory. Unlike the earlier raids and temporary occupations that had characterized Germanic activity during the 3rd and 4th centuries, Frankish settlement represented a systematic colonization effort that involved entire tribal populations seeking permanent homes in the fertile river valleys of northern Gaul. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Scheldt and Meuse rivers reveals extensive Frankish cemeteries dating from the early 5th century, containing distinctive grave goods that demonstrate the presence of complete family groups including women, children, and elderly individuals who had clearly come to stay rather than simply raid. The material culture found in these early Frankish settlements shows significant continuity with Germanic traditions from beyond the Rhine, while incorporating elements adapted from Romano-Belgic practices. Frankish warriors were buried with their characteristic Franziska throwing axes, long swords with pattern-welded blades, and shield bosses decorated with geometric designs that reflected traditional Germanic artistic preferences. However, these weapons often accompanied Roman-style belt fittings, imported glass vessels, and coins that demonstrate ongoing commercial relationships with Roman territories and administrative systems. Female burials contain distinctive Frankish jewellery including large bow brooches and bead necklaces, alongside Roman-style hairpins and cosmetic implements that suggest cultural adaptation was occurring within the domestic sphere, as well as in military contexts. The process of Frankish territorial acquisition involved both violent conquest and negotiated settlement arrangements that reflected the complex political situation throughout northern Gaul during the early 5th century. Some Frankish groups established themselves through military force, overwhelming weakened Roman garrisons and displacing existing populations who fled southward toward more secure territories. Archaeological evidence from villa sites near modern Brussels shows destruction layers dating to the early 5th century, with evidence of burning and hasty abandonment that suggests violent displacement of Romano-Belgic landowners. However, other Frankish settlements appear to have been established through foederati agreements with Roman authorities who recognised that Germanic federates could provide more effective territorial defence than increasingly unreliable imperial forces. The foederati system, which had been employed sporadically throughout the later empire, became the primary mechanism for managing barbarian settlement in territories where Roman administrative control remained nominally intact. Under these arrangements, Frankish leaders received official recognition as Roman allies and were granted territorial concessions in exchange for military service and loyalty to imperial authority. The Frankish king Childeric, whose elaborate tomb was discovered at Tournai in 1653, exemplified this hybrid status as both Germanic war leader and Roman foederatus. His burial goods included traditional Frankish weapons and regalia alongside Roman military insignia and imperial coins that demonstrated his dual role within both Germanic and Roman political systems. Childeric's tomb, dating to approximately 481 AD, contained over 300 gold bees that may have served as decorative elements on his royal cloak, along with a signet ring bearing his name in Latin characters. The presence of Roman military equipment, including a spatha sword and decorative horse harness fittings, indicates his integration into Roman military hierarchy, while traditional Germanic grave goods such as the Franziska and shield boss maintained his credentials within Frankish warrior culture. This material evidence demonstrates the complex cultural negotiations required for successful barbarian leadership during the transitional period when Roman and Germanic political systems coexisted uneasily throughout former Belgic territories. The transformation of Roman villa estates under Frankish rule reveals the economic and social changes that accompanied barbarian settlement throughout the region. Many villa complexes that had served as centres of Romano-Belgic agricultural production were abandoned or substantially modified as Frankish settlers implemented different agricultural practices and social organisations. The villa at Anthe, which had operated as a sophisticated agricultural enterprise throughout the imperial period, shows evidence of structural modifications during the 5th century that suggest its conversion to a Frankish royal residence or administrative centre. Roman-style residential quarters were maintained and even enhanced, while agricultural processing facilities were modified to accommodate Germanic farming techniques and storage requirements. Archaeological investigations at rural sites throughout former Belgic territories reveal the gradual transition from Roman villa-based agriculture to Frankish village communities that organised land use and agricultural production according to different principles. Frankish settlements typically consisted of scattered farmsteads, rather than the centralised villa complexes that had characterised Roman agricultural organisation. These farmsteads, constructed using traditional Germanic building techniques with timber frames and thatched roofs, were surrounded by small field systems that individual families worked using simple iron tools and wooden ploughs. The shift from large-scale estate agriculture to smaller-scale family farming represented a fundamental reorganisation of rural society that affected every aspect of economic and social life throughout the region. Urban centres experienced varying degrees of continuity and transformation under Frankish rule, depending on their strategic importance and the circumstances of barbarian takeover. Augusta Treverorum maintained significant population and administrative functions due to its position as a regional capital and its substantial defensive fortifications. Frankish rulers recognised the city's value as an administrative centre and invested resources in maintaining its infrastructure while adapting its governmental institutions to Germanic political practices. The city's walls were maintained and strengthened, while public buildings were converted to serve new administrative and ceremonial functions that reflected Frankish royal authority rather than Roman imperial administration. The basilica at Augusta Treverorum, originally constructed for Roman legal and commercial activities, was converted during the 5th century to serve as a royal hall where Frankish kings held court and conducted diplomatic negotiations. Archaeological evidence shows substantial modifications to the building's interior, including the installation of a raised platform for the royal throne and the construction of separate quarters for the king's retinue and visiting dignitaries. These modifications preserved the building's monumental character while adapting it to Germanic ceremonial requirements and political practices that emphasized personal relationships between rulers and their followers rather than the bureaucratic procedures that had characterized Roman administration. Smaller urban centres throughout former Belgic territories experienced more dramatic transformations as Frankish settlement disrupted the commercial networks and administrative systems that had sustained Roman town life. Bagacum, the former administrative centre of Nervid territory, saw substantial population decline as its Roman civic functions became irrelevant under Frankish rule. Archaeological evidence from the town's residential district shows the abandonment of Roman-style houses and their replacement by Germanic timber buildings that reflected different domestic practices and social organisations. The town's amphitheatre was partially dismantled during this period, with its stone blocks reused for constructing defensive walls and residential buildings that served the reduced urban population. The economic transformation accompanying Frankish settlement involved fundamental changes in production methods, trade relationships, and monetary systems that affected every level of society throughout former Belgic territories. Roman commercial networks, which had connected the region with markets throughout the Mediterranean world, largely collapsed as political instability and barbarian settlement disrupted long-distance transportation and communication. Local production replaced imported goods in most market categories, while specialised crafts that had supplied luxury markets virtually disappeared due to lack of demand and disrupted supply chains for raw materials. Pottery production exemplifies the broader economic changes occurring throughout the region during this transitional period. The sophisticated terra sigillata workshops that had supplied markets throughout northern Europe ceased production during the early 5th century as Germanic settlers demonstrated different preferences for ceramic goods. Frankish pottery, produced using traditional hand-building techniques rather than the wheel-thrown methods that had characterized Roman production, featured simpler forms and decorative schemes that reflected Germanic aesthetic preferences and functional requirements. Archaeological assemblages from Frankish settlements contain predominantly handmade cooking pots, storage jars, and drinking vessels that show clear continuity with Germanic traditions from beyond the Rhine. Metalworking traditions experienced similar transformations as Frankish smiths adapted Roman techniques and equipment to produce weapons and tools that served Germanic cultural preferences and military requirements. Frankish weapon production emphasized the creation of pattern-welded sword blades that combined functional effectiveness with decorative beauty through the manipulation of different iron and steel alloys. These weapons required sophisticated metallurgical knowledge and considerable skill to produce, indicating that Frankish craftsmen possessed technical expertise that equaled or exceeded that of their Roman predecessors. However, the production was organized according to Germanic social relationships, with smiths serving particular war leaders or royal courts rather than supplying anonymous commercial markets. The gradual decline of Roman monetary systems throughout former Belgic territories reflected broader changes in economic organization and commercial relationships under barbarian rule. Coin finds from archaeological sites show a dramatic decrease in new Roman coins after approximately 450 AD, while hoards buried during this period often contain substantial quantities of silver and gold objects that suggest the conversion of monetary wealth into portable treasure that could be more easily protected during unstable political conditions. Frankish leaders began issuing their own gold coins during the late 5th century, but these served primarily ceremonial and diplomatic functions, rather than facilitating routine commercial transactions. The persistence of Romano-Belgic populations within territories controlled by Frankish settlers created complex cultural negotiations that influenced every aspect of daily life throughout the region. Archaeological evidence suggests that complete population replacement was rare, with Germanic settlers typically constituting a minority within territories they controlled politically and militarily. This demographic situation required ongoing accommodation between different cultural traditions, legal systems, and social practices that gradually produced hybrid cultural forms combining Germanic and Romano-Celtic elements. Legal systems operating within Frankish territories reflected this cultural complexity through the maintenance of separate legal traditions for different population groups, while establishing mechanisms for resolving disputes between Germanic and Romano-Belgic communities. The Salic law, codified during the late 5th or early 6th century, preserved traditional Frankish legal principles while incorporating Roman legal concepts that addressed the practical needs of governing mixed populations. The code established different compensation schedules for crimes committed against Franks and Romans, while providing procedures for legal proceedings that could accommodate both Germanic and Roman legal traditions. Religious transformation during this period involved complex interactions between Frankish paganism, Romano-Celtic religious traditions, and the expanding influence of Christianity throughout former Belgic territories. Many Frankish settlers initially maintained traditional Germanic religious practices centered on the worship of Woden, Donar, and other deities associated with war, fertility, and natural forces. Archaeological evidence from Frankish cemeteries includes grave goods such as miniature weapons, animal figurines, and ceremonial drinking vessels that suggest continued belief in Germanic concepts of the afterlife and divine intervention in human affairs. The gradual conversion of Frankish populations to Christianity represented one of the most significant cultural transformations of the late 5th century, with profound implications for political organization, social relationships, and cultural identity throughout the region. The conversion of Clovis, Childric's son and successor, around 496 AD marked a crucial turning point that aligned Frankish political authority with the Christian religious establishment that had maintained significant influence among Romano-Belgic populations. This religious conversion facilitated political integration between Germanic rulers and their Romano-Celtic subjects, while providing ideological justification for Frankish territorial expansion and political authority. Christian missionary activity among Frankish populations involved careful adaptation of religious teachings to Germanic cultural contexts, while maintaining essential theological principles that connected local Christian communities with broader ecclesiastical networks. Missionaries like St. Remigius of Reims demonstrated remarkable skill in presenting Christian concepts using Germanic cultural references and symbolic systems that made the new religion comprehensible and attractive to warrior societies that valued courage, loyalty, and personal honour. The baptism of Clovis and his warriors at Reims represented both a personal religious conversion and a political alliance that strengthened Frankish authority while expanding Christian influence throughout northern Gaul. The establishment of Frankish royal courts throughout former Belgic territories created new centres of political and cultural authority that combined Germanic traditions of personal kingship with Roman concepts of territorial administration. These courts, typically located in fortified positions that could provide security during unstable political conditions, served as venues for diplomatic negotiations, legal proceedings, and ceremonial activities that demonstrated royal authority while maintaining traditional relationships between kings and their warrior followers. The court at Tournai, established by Childeric and maintained by his successors, exemplified this hybrid political institution that preserved Germanic cultural identity while adapting to the practical requirements of governing Romanized territories. Frankish royal administration developed institutional mechanisms that could coordinate governance across territories inhabited by diverse populations with different cultural traditions and legal expectations. Royal officials, drawn from both Germanic and Romano-Belgic backgrounds, served as intermediaries between royal authority and local communities, while implementing policies that balanced competing interests and cultural preferences. These administrative arrangements preserved essential governmental functions while adapting them to Germanic political principles that emphasized personal relationships and reciprocal obligations rather than bureaucratic procedures. The collapse of Roman administrative structures throughout former Belgic territories created opportunities for local communities to develop autonomous governmental institutions that addressed their specific needs and circumstances. Some Romano-Belgic communities maintained quasi-Roman civic institutions under Frankish oversight, while others adopted Germanic organisational principles that proved more compatible with changed political and economic conditions. These local adaptations created diverse governmental arrangements that reflected the complex cultural negotiations occurring throughout the region during this transitional period. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites throughout former Belgic territories reveals the material impact of these political and cultural transformations on daily life during the 5th century. Domestic architecture evolved to accommodate both Germanic building traditions and practical adaptations to local environmental conditions, while household assemblages show the gradual replacement of Roman manufactured goods with locally produced items that reflected changing cultural preferences and economic relationships. The persistence of certain Roman cultural elements, particularly in areas related to food preparation, personal hygiene, and domestic comfort, demonstrates the selective nature of cultural change during this period of political transformation. The persistence of certain Roman cultural elements, particularly in areas related to food preparation, personal hygiene, and domestic comfort, demonstrates the selective nature of cultural change during this period of political transformation. The establishment of Frankish kingdoms across former Belgic territories between 500 and 750 AD created a complex political landscape where Germanic royal authority operated alongside surviving Roman administrative practices and emerging Christian ecclesiastical structures. This tripartite system of governance produced unique institutional arrangements that would define the character of Merovingian civilization throughout the early medieval period. The Kingdom of Austrasia emerged as the most significant Frankish political entity, controlling former Belgic territories, encompassing lands from the Rhine frontier westward to the Scheldt Valley and southward into the Ardennes forests. Clovis's division of his realm among his 4 sons in 511 AD established Austrasia as a distinct kingdom centred on the strategic cities of Reims and Metz, though the royal court frequently relocated between various fortified positions throughout the territory. Archaeological evidence from sites like Crefeld-Gelep and Lavoy reveals the material culture of Austrasian royal centres, where Frankish kings maintained elaborate courts that combined Germanic warrior traditions with Roman ceremonial practices adapted to serve new political purposes. The Austrasian royal palace at Metz, constructed during the mid-6th century, exemplified the architectural synthesis that characterised Merovingian royal residences throughout former Belgic territories. The complex incorporated Roman building techniques, including stonemasonry and tile roofing, while its layout reflected Germanic concepts of royal authority centred on a great hall where the king held court surrounded by his warrior retinue. Archaeological investigations have revealed foundations of substantial timber and stone buildings arranged around central courtyards, with specialised structures including armouries, treasuries and residential quarters for royal officials and their families. The palace's defensive walls incorporated Roman military engineering principles while adapting them to Germanic concepts of fortification that emphasised the protection of royal authority rather than urban populations. Belgic cities that had served as Roman administrative centres experienced varying degrees of continuity and transformation under Merovingian rule, depending on their strategic value and the circumstances of Frankish acquisition. Tongeren, the former capital of the Tungri, maintained significant urban functions throughout the 6th century as Frankish kings recognised its importance as a commercial centre, controlling trade routes between the Rhine Valley and the North Sea coast. The city's Roman walls were maintained and strengthened, while its basilica was converted to serve as a royal courthouse, where Frankish legal procedures operated alongside Roman law for different population groups. Excavations within the city have revealed Merovingian period modifications to Roman buildings, including the installation of Germanic-style hearths and the construction of timber additions that accommodated Frankish domestic practices within Roman architectural frameworks. The transformation of Beauvais from its Roman incarnation as Bagacum demonstrates the complex processes of urban adaptation under Frankish rule. The city's strategic position along major road networks made it valuable for Merovingian administration, but its Roman civic institutions proved incompatible with Germanic political practices. Archaeological evidence shows the gradual abandonment of Roman public buildings during the 6th century, with their stone blocks reused for constructing smaller structures that served Frankish administrative and residential needs. The Forum complex was partially dismantled, while the amphitheatre became a quarry for building materials used throughout the surrounding region. However, the city maintained important commercial functions, with archaeological assemblages revealing continued craft production and trade relationships that connected Austrasian territories with markets throughout northern Europe. The administrative structure of Austrasian territories incorporated both Frankish and Roman governmental traditions. Through the development of hybrid institutions that could address the practical needs of governing diverse populations, the Comes or Count system established territorial jurisdictions that combined Germanic concepts of royal delegation with Roman administrative districts, creating governmental units that preserved essential civic functions while adapting them to Frankish political principles. These counties, typically centred on fortified positions that could provide security during conflicts, served as focal points for royal authority while maintaining connections with local communities through traditional leaders who operated under Frankish oversight. The Count of the Ardennes, controlling territories that had formerly belonged to the Eburones and adjacent tribes, exemplified this hybrid administrative system. Archaeological evidence from sites like Saint-Hubert reveals substantial fortified complexes dating from the 6th and 7th centuries, where Frankish counts maintained courts that combined military, judicial, and administrative functions. These complexes included great halls for ceremonial activities, residential quarters for the count's household, workshops for producing weapons and luxury goods, and storage facilities for collecting and distributing agricultural surpluses that supported royal administration. The counts served as intermediaries between royal authority and local populations, implementing royal policies while maintaining the personal relationships that characterized Germanic political systems. Agricultural organization throughout former Belgic territories underwent fundamental transformation as Frankish settlement patterns replaced Roman villa-based production with village communities organized according to Germanic social principles. The typical Frankish village consisted of scattered farmsteads inhabited by extended family groups who worked individual holdings within larger territorial units controlled by noble landowners or royal officials. Archaeological investigations at sites like Warendorf and Gladbach have revealed the physical characteristics of these settlements, including timber longhouses that accommodated both human residents and livestock, storage buildings for agricultural products, and craft workshops that produced tools and household goods for local consumption. The Frankish agricultural system emphasized cereal production, using techniques that combined Germanic farming knowledge with Roman innovations adapted to Northern European environmental conditions. Excavations at rural sites throughout the region have uncovered evidence of iron ploughshares, harvesting tools, and grain processing equipment that demonstrate technological continuity with Roman agricultural practices while incorporating Germanic organizational methods. Field systems associated with Frankish villages typically featured smaller plots worked by individual families, rather than the extensive estates that had characterized Roman agricultural organization, reflecting different concepts of land ownership and labor organization that emphasized kinship relationships rather than commercial production. Craft production within Merovingian territories developed distinctive characteristics that combined Germanic artistic traditions with Roman technical knowledge preserved through Christian monasteries and surviving Romano-Belgic communities. Metalworking shops established at royal centres and major settlements produced weapons, jewellery and ceremonial objects that demonstrated sophisticated technical skills while reflecting Germanic aesthetic preferences. The workshop complex at Maastricht, operating during the 6th and 7th centuries, produced elaborate belt fittings, brooches and weapons decorated with intricate geometric patterns and animal motifs that exemplified Merovingian artistic achievement. These objects, found in elite burials throughout former Belgic territories, demonstrate the continuation of Germanic cultural identity within territories that had experienced centuries of Roman influence. The production of manuscripts within monastic scriptoria, established throughout former Belgic territories, created new forms of cultural synthesis that preserved classical learning while adapting it to Christian theological purposes and Germanic artistic sensibilities. The monastery of Echternach, founded by the Anglo-Saxon missionary Willibrord around 698 AD, became a major centre for manuscript production that combined Irish, Anglo-Saxon and continental European artistic traditions. The famous Echternach Gospels, produced during the early 8th century, feature elaborate illuminated initials that incorporate Germanic interlace patterns with Christian iconographic programs, creating visual representations of the cultural fusion occurring throughout the region. The scriptorium at Echternach employed scribes and illuminators drawn from diverse cultural backgrounds, including Irish monks trained in Celtic artistic traditions, Germanic craftsmen skilled in metalwork and jewellery production, and Romano-Belgic scholars familiar with classical Latin texts and Roman artistic conventions. This cultural diversity produced manuscripts that demonstrated remarkable artistic innovation, while preserving essential texts that would prove crucial for maintaining educational and administrative capabilities throughout the early medieval period. The monastery's library contained works by classical authors, including Virgil, Ovid, and Cicero, alongside Christian theological texts and Germanic legal codes that reflected the intellectual complexity of Merovingian civilization. Trade networks operating throughout Merovingian territories connected former Belgic lands with markets extending from the British Isles to the Mediterranean basin, though these commercial relationships differed significantly from the systematic trade systems that had characterized the Roman period. Frankish merchants, often operating under royal protection and patronage, established trading relationships that emphasized luxury goods and specialized products rather than the bulk commodities that had dominated Roman commerce. Archaeological evidence from sites along the Meuse and Rhine rivers reveals the presence of imported goods including Byzantine silk fabrics, Mediterranean glass vessels, and Anglo-Saxon metalwork that demonstrate the continuation of long-distance trade relationships despite political fragmentation. The port of Quentovic, established during the 7th century near modern Etaples, became a major commercial centre that connected Frankish territories with Anglo-Saxon England and Scandinavian markets. Archaeological investigations at the site have revealed substantial timber buildings that served as warehouses, workshops, and residential quarters for merchants and craftsmen involved in international trade. The site's material assemblages include pottery from the Rhineland, glass from northern France, and metalwork from Anglo-Saxon England, demonstrating the diverse commercial relationships that sustained Merovingian economic systems. Coins found at Quentovic include Merovingian gold tremisses alongside Anglo-Saxon ciatus and Byzantine solidi, indicating the complex monetary systems that facilitated international commerce during this period. The development of Merovingian coinage reflected both the continuation of Roman monetary traditions and adaptations to Germanic political and economic practices. Frankish kings began issuing gold coins during the late 5th century, initially copying Roman imperial types before developing distinctive iconographic programs that emphasized royal authority and Christian symbolism. The mint at Metz, operating under Austrasian royal authority, produced tremises that featured royal portraits alongside Christian crosses and Germanic decorative motifs, creating visual representations of the cultural synthesis that characterized Merovingian civilization. These coins circulated throughout former Belgic territories and beyond, serving both economic functions and political propaganda that demonstrated royal authority and cultural identity. The role of silver in Merovingian monetary systems became increasingly important during the 7th century, as gold supplies from Mediterranean sources became less reliable due to political disruptions and changing trade patterns. Archaeological evidence from hoards and individual coin finds suggests that silver coins began supplementing gold currency for routine commercial transactions, while gold remained reserved for ceremonial purposes and high-value exchanges. This transition reflected broader economic changes occurring throughout Northern Europe as regional production and trade networks adapted to reduced Mediterranean connections and increased reliance on local resources and markets. Christian ecclesiastical institutions played crucial roles in preserving administrative practices and cultural traditions derived from the Roman period, serving as bridges between classical antiquity and emerging medieval civilization. Bishops established in former Belgic cities maintained educational institutions that preserved Latin literacy and classical learning while adapting these traditions to serve Christian theological and pastoral purposes. The Episcopal School at Reims, founded during the 5th century, provided instruction in Latin grammar, rhetoric and theology that prepared clergy for administrative and pastoral responsibilities while maintaining intellectual connections with broader Christian communities throughout Europe. The monastery of Stavelo-Malmedy, founded around 650 AD by the Frankish nobleman Remaclius, exemplified the role of monastic institutions in preserving and transmitting cultural traditions throughout former Belgic territories. The monastery's scriptorium produced copies of classical texts alongside Christian theological works, while its school provided education for both monastic and secular students who would serve in royal administration and ecclesiastical hierarchy. The monastery's extensive landholdings, granted by Frankish kings and noble patrons, created economic resources that supported cultural activities while demonstrating the integration of Christian institutions into Merovingian political and social systems. Archaeological evidence from monastic sites throughout the region reveals the material culture of Christian communities that combined ascetic religious practices with sophisticated cultural and economic activities. Excavations at the monastery of Nivelles have uncovered evidence of substantial stone buildings, including churches, residential quarters, workshops and storage facilities that supported large monastic communities. The site's material assemblages include imported luxury goods such as Byzantine silk fabrics and Mediterranean glass vessels, indicating that monastic communities participated in long-distance trade networks while maintaining their spiritual commitments and cultural responsibilities. The preservation of Roman legal traditions within Christian ecclesiastical contexts provided essential continuity in administrative practices and legal procedures that facilitated governance of diverse populations throughout former Belgic territories. Canon law, developed by church councils and episcopal authorities, incorporated Roman legal principles while adapting them to Christian theological requirements and pastoral needs. The decisions of the Council of Orleans and subsequent ecclesiastical assemblies established legal frameworks that governed Christian communities while providing models for secular legal development that influenced Frankish royal legislation and administrative practices. The gradual development of written law codes throughout Merovingian territories reflected the complex cultural negotiations required for governing populations with different legal traditions and social expectations. The Lex Salica, probably codified during the early 6th century, preserved traditional Frankish legal principles while incorporating Roman legal concepts that addressed practical governance needs in territories with substantial Romano-Belgic populations. The code's provisions regarding property rights, inheritance procedures, and criminal penalties demonstrate the synthesis of Germanic and Roman legal traditions that characterized Merovingian legal systems throughout former Belgic territories. Settlement patterns that emerged throughout the region during the 6th and 7th centuries reflected the complex interplay of Germanic colonization, Romano-Belgic population survival, and Christian institutional development that shaped early medieval society. Archaeological surveys have revealed the establishment of new village communities at sites that provided access to agricultural resources, while maintaining defensive capabilities during periods of political instability. These settlements typically featured dispersed farmsteads, organised around central areas that served communal functions, including religious observances, legal proceedings, and seasonal celebrations that maintained community cohesion and cultural identity. The material culture recovered from these settlement sites demonstrates the gradual development of distinctive regional traditions that combined Germanic, Roman, and Christian cultural elements in unique configurations that reflected local circumstances and historical experiences. However, the historical memory of the Belgae themselves began to fade as Merovingian kingdoms consolidated their control and new political identities emerged throughout the former Confederation territories. The systematic preservation and interpretation of Belgic history would depend largely on medieval chroniclers who approached these ancient peoples through the lens of their own cultural assumptions and political objectives. Gregory of Tours, writing his Historia Francorum in the late 6th century, provided one of the earliest post-classical treatments of Belgic history within a broader narrative of Frankish political development. Gregory's account drew heavily on Caesar's Commentaria de Bello Gallico, but his interpretation reflected the political and religious concerns of Merovingian Francia, rather than genuine historical interest in pre-Roman Celtic societies. Gregory portrayed the Belgae as fierce barbarians, whose resistance to Roman civilization demonstrated the primitive nature of pagan societies, while simultaneously praising their courage as ancestors of the Christian Franks who had inherited their territorial domains. This dual perspective created lasting ambiguities in medieval understanding of Belgic history that would influence scholarly interpretation for centuries. Gregory's treatment of the Battle of Sabis exemplified his approach to ancient history as moral instruction for contemporary audiences. His description emphasized the divine providence that enabled Roman victory over pagan forces, while portraying Belgic resistance as misguided opposition to civilizing influences that God intended to spread throughout Europe. The Nervi received particular attention as examples of noble savagery whose fierce independence demonstrated both admirable courage and tragic ignorance of Christian truth. Gregory's narrative established interpretive frameworks that medieval readers would apply to Belgic history, emphasizing religious and moral lessons rather than systematic historical analysis. Later, Frankish chroniclers continued this pattern of selective interpretation, incorporating Belgic history into genealogical narratives that legitimize contemporary political arrangements. The anonymous author of the Liber Historia Francorum, composed around 727 AD, traced Frankish origins to Trojan refugees who had allegedly settled in Germanic territories before conquering Gaul from its Celtic inhabitants. This fabricated genealogy relegated the Belgae to the role of displaced natives whose defeat by Frankish ancestors demonstrated divine approval for Germanic rule throughout former Roman territories. Such narratives reflected medieval concepts of political legitimacy based on conquest and divine sanction rather than historical accuracy or cultural continuity. The Carolingian Renaissance of the 8th and 9th centuries brought renewed scholarly interest in classical texts, including Caesar's accounts of the Belgic Wars, but this revival occurred within intellectual frameworks that prioritized moral and theological instruction over historical understanding. Alcuin of York, serving as educational advisor to Charlemagne, incorporated Caesar's writings into the palace school curriculum as examples of classical Latin prose and military strategy, rather than sources for understanding pre-Christian European societies. Students learned to analyze Caesar's tactical descriptions and rhetorical techniques while accepting his cultural judgments about Celtic barbarism and Roman civilizing missions without critical examination. Einhard's Vita Caroli Magni demonstrated how Carolingian scholars approached ancient history as a source of exemplar for contemporary political leadership. Einhard's biography of Charlemagne included comparisons between the emperor's Germanic campaigns and Caesar's conquest of Gaul, portraying both as divinely sanctioned missions to extend Christian civilization among pagan peoples. The Belgae appeared in these narratives as predecessors of the Saxon and other Germanic tribes that Charlemagne conquered, their ancient resistance to Roman authority serving as a historical precedent for contemporary military campaigns against unconverted populations beyond the Rhine frontier. Monastic chroniclers throughout the medieval period preserved Caesar's accounts within manuscript traditions that maintained textual accuracy, while embedding them in interpretive contexts that reflected Christian theological perspectives. The monastery of Saint-Bertin, located in former Morini territory, possessed multiple copies of the Commentarii that monks used for Latin instruction and historical reference. However, their understanding of Belgic society remained constrained by medieval assumptions about pagan religion, political organisation, and cultural development that prevented genuine appreciation of Celtic achievements or historical significance beyond their role as Roman adversaries. The preservation of classical texts in monastic libraries proved crucial for later scholarly rediscovery of Belgic history. though medieval copying practices sometimes introduced errors or modifications that reflected contemporary concerns. Manuscripts of Caesar's works produced at scriptoria like Corbie and Saint-Amand occasionally included marginal notes or textual variants that demonstrated medieval efforts to reconcile ancient accounts with contemporary geographical knowledge or political arrangements. These modifications, while problematic for textual accuracy, provide valuable evidence for medieval historical consciousness and the ways classical antiquity was understood within Christian intellectual frameworks. Medieval cartographic traditions further complicated historical understanding of Belgic territories by applying contemporary political boundaries and settlement patterns to ancient geographical descriptions. Maps produced during the 12th and 13th centuries typically showed Caesar's Belgic tribes occupying territories that corresponded roughly to medieval counties and duchies, creating anachronistic impressions of ancient political organisation that influenced scholarly interpretation well into the modern period. The famous Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300, located the Belgae within geographical frameworks that reflected medieval rather than ancient territorial arrangements. The Renaissance brought dramatic changes in scholarly approaches to ancient history as humanist scholars developed new methods for analysing classical texts and archaeological evidence. Lorenzo Valla's demonstration that the donation of Constantine was a medieval forgery established precedents for critical textual analysis that scholars would eventually apply to ancient historical sources. However, initial Renaissance interest in Belgic history remained limited due to the period's focus on Greek and Roman achievements, rather than the barbarian societies that classical authors had described as primitive and culturally inferior. The development of antiquarian studies during the 16th and 17th centuries marked the beginning of systematic efforts to understand pre-Roman European societies through both textual analysis and material evidence. Scholars like William Camden in England and Johannes Pontanus in the Low Countries began collecting archaeological artefacts and correlating them with classical descriptions of ancient peoples. Camden's Britannia, first published in 1586, included detailed discussions of Belgic settlements in southeastern England, based on coin finds and earthwork remains that demonstrated sophisticated approaches to combining literary and material evidence. Pontanus's Historia Gelricae, published in 1639, represented one of the first systematic attempts to reconstruct Belgic history using both classical sources and archaeological discoveries from the Low Countries. Pontanus examined Roman coins, stone inscriptions and burial remains that had been discovered throughout former Belgic territories, correlating these finds with Caesar's geographical descriptions and tribal identifications. His work established methodological precedents for later archaeological investigations, while demonstrating the potential for recovering detailed information about pre-Roman societies through systematic material analysis. The Enlightenment period witnessed growing scholarly interest in Celtic societies as examples of primitive European culture that could illuminate the developmental stages through which all human societies had presumably progressed. Voltaire's philosophical history emphasized the contrast between Celtic barbarism and Roman civilization, portraying the Belgic Wars as crucial episodes in the triumph of reason and law over superstition and violence. This interpretive framework, while problematic in its cultural assumptions, encouraged detailed study of ancient sources and archaeological evidence that advanced scholarly understanding of pre-Roman European societies. The emergence of Celtic archaeology as a distinct scholarly discipline during the 18th century owed much to discoveries in former Belgic territories that demonstrated the sophistication of pre-Roman material culture. The excavation of rich burial sites at locations like Sombion and Beru revealed elaborate metalwork, imported luxury goods, and artistic achievements that challenged assumptions about Celtic cultural primitiveness. These discoveries prompted scholarly reassessment of classical accounts that had emphasized Belgic ferocity and barbarism, while overlooking evidence for sophisticated political organisation and cultural achievements. Napoleon's campaigns throughout Europe stimulated archaeological interest by exposing ancient sites and artefacts to scholarly examination, while creating opportunities for systematic excavation and artefact collection. The discovery of the Childeric treasure at Tournai in 1653 had already demonstrated the potential for recovering spectacular archaeological evidence from the transitional period between Roman rule and barbarian kingdoms. Similar discoveries during the Napoleonic period, including elaborate Merovingian burials and Roman urban sites, provided material evidence that complemented and sometimes contradicted literary sources about ancient and early medieval societies. The development of national consciousness throughout 19th century Europe created new contexts for interpreting Belgic history, as various ethnic groups claimed ancient peoples as ancestral populations that legitimized contemporary political arrangements. Belgian independence in 1830 prompted scholarly interest in pre-Roman inhabitants, who could serve as foundational figures for national identity formation. Historians like Henri Conscience and Charles de Coster incorporated romanticized versions of Belgic resistance against Roman conquest into nationalist narratives that portrayed ancient tribal confederations as predecessors of modern Belgian unity against foreign domination. French nationalist historians during the same period claimed the Belgae as ancestors of the French people, emphasizing their role within Gallic resistance to Roman imperialism, while downplaying their distinct cultural identity and political organization. The archaeological discoveries at sites like Bibracte and Alesia provided material evidence that French scholars used to reconstruct ancient Gallic civilization, though their interpretations often emphasized pan-Gallic unity, rather than the regional distinctions that had characterized different Celtic peoples. This nationalist appropriation of ancient history created competing claims about Belgic legacy that reflected contemporary political tensions rather than historical accuracy. German Romantic nationalism produced similar claims about Germanic elements within Belgic society, particularly regarding tribes like the Eburones and Cimbri, who had maintained connections with trans-Rhenish populations. Scholars like Jacob Grimm incorporated Belgic history into broader narratives about Germanic cultural expansion that portrayed Celtic societies as transitional stages in the development of superior Germanic civilization. These interpretations, while politically motivated, encouraged detailed study of archaeological evidence and linguistic analysis that advanced scholarly understanding of cultural interactions between Celtic and Germanic peoples. The establishment of professional archaeological institutions during the late 19th century created systematic frameworks for investigating Belgic sites and interpreting material evidence according to scientific rather than nationalist criteria. The formation of archaeological societies in Belgium, France, and Germany facilitated collaboration between scholars who shared methodological approaches despite their different national perspectives. Excavations conducted under these institutional auspices produced detailed documentation of site stratigraphy, artifact contexts, and chronological relationships that enabled more accurate reconstruction of ancient societies and cultural processes. The excavation of the Belgic oppidum at Bibracte by Jacques-Gabriel Bullios beginning in 1864 demonstrated the potential for large-scale archaeological investigation to recover detailed information about pre-Roman urban development and material culture. Bulliot's systematic approach to site documentation, including detailed plans, artifact catalogues, and stratigraphic analysis, established methodological standards that influenced archaeological practice throughout Europe. The discoveries at Bibracte revealed sophisticated urban planning, specialized craft production, and extensive trade networks that challenged assumptions about Celtic cultural limitations while providing concrete evidence for complex social and economic organization. Similar excavations at sites like Manching in Bavaria and Entremont in Provence expanded scholarly understanding of Celtic urban development while revealing regional variations in material culture and settlement organisation. These investigations demonstrated that the Belgae participated in broader patterns of late Iron Age cultural development, while maintaining distinctive characteristics that reflected their specific historical experiences and geographical circumstances. The comparative analysis of archaeological assemblages from different Celtic sites enabled scholars to identify shared cultural elements while recognizing the diversity that had characterized pre-Roman European societies. The development of scientific dating methods during the 20th century revolutionized archaeological approaches to Belgic history by providing accurate chronological frameworks for understanding cultural change and historical development. Radiocarbon dating, dendrochronology, and thermoluminescence techniques enabled archaeologists to establish precise dates for ancient sites and artifacts, resolving chronological problems that had plagued earlier scholarship. These scientific methods confirmed the general accuracy of Caesar's historical accounts, while revealing complexities in cultural development that literary sources had not documented. Aerial photography and remote sensing technologies developed during and after World War II provided new tools for identifying and investigating archaeological sites throughout former Belgic territories. Aerial surveys revealed extensive field systems, settlement patterns, and defensive earthworks that had been invisible to ground-based investigation. The discovery of previously unknown oppida and villa sites through aerial reconnaissance demonstrated the density of ancient settlement and the sophistication of land use systems that had supported substantial populations throughout the late Iron Age and Roman periods. Modern excavation techniques, including stratigraphic analysis, environmental sampling, and computer-assisted documentation, have produced detailed reconstructions of ancient life that far exceed the scope of earlier archaeological investigations. The excavation of waterlogged sites like Glastonbury and Flag Fen has preserved organic materials including wooden tools, textile fragments, and food remains that provide intimate glimpses of daily life in ancient Celtic communities. Similar preservation conditions at sites in former Belgic territories have yielded comparable evidence for ancient technology, diet, and domestic practices. The application of scientific analysis to archaeological artifacts has revealed sophisticated technologies and extensive trade networks that demonstrate the complexity of pre-Roman European societies. Metallurgical analysis of Belgic weapons and tools has shown advanced knowledge of iron and steel production, while chemical analysis of pottery and glass has traced raw material sources and manufacturing techniques. These scientific approaches have confirmed the extensive commercial relationships that connected Belgic territories with markets throughout Europe, while revealing the technical expertise that characterized Celtic craftsmanship. Contemporary archaeological research continues to expand understanding of Belgic society through interdisciplinary approaches that combine traditional excavation methods with scientific analysis, environmental reconstruction, and comparative studies. Recent discoveries at sites like Coront in central France have revealed monumental architecture and urban planning that demonstrate the sophistication of late Iron Age Celtic civilization. These findings challenge lingering assumptions about Celtic cultural limitations while providing detailed evidence for complex social hierarchies, religious practices, and political organization. The integration of archaeological evidence with historical linguistics has illuminated the cultural processes that shaped ancient European societies while revealing the complexity of ethnic and political identities in pre-Roman periods. Studies of place names, personal names, and linguistic borrowings have traced population movements and cultural interactions that complement archaeological evidence for material culture change. This interdisciplinary approach has demonstrated that ancient ethnic identities were more fluid and complex than classical authors had suggested, with the Belgae representing a confederation of diverse peoples rather than a single homogeneous tribe. Modern scholarly assessment recognizes the Belgae as sophisticated societies that played crucial roles in late Iron Age European development, while maintaining distinct cultural identities within broader Celtic civilization. Their political confederations, urban settlements, and military organizations demonstrate adaptive capabilities that enabled them to thrive in changing historical circumstances while preserving essential cultural values and practices. The archaeological record reveals artistic achievements, technological innovations, and commercial networks that establish the Belgae as significant contributors to European cultural development rather than merely obstacles to Roman expansion. The lasting influence of Belgic culture extends far beyond their direct territorial legacy to encompass contributions to European political organisation, artistic traditions, and cultural identity that continue to influence contemporary society. Their federal political structures provided models for medieval and modern confederate systems, while their artistic traditions influenced decorative arts throughout Northern Europe. The archaeological preservation of Belgic sites and artifacts provides ongoing opportunities for scholarly research and public education that maintain connections between contemporary populations and their ancient predecessors. The historical memory of the Belgae thus represents a complex interplay of ancient achievement, medieval interpretation, scholarly rediscovery, and modern appreciation that demonstrates the continuing relevance of ancient history for understanding contemporary European identity and cultural development. From their emergence as a distinct confederation in the late Iron Age, through their conquest by Rome and transformation under Germanic rule, the Belgae created lasting legacies that transcend their immediate historical circumstances to influence subsequent generations throughout European history. Their story exemplifies the dynamic nature of cultural identity and political organisation, while demonstrating the resilience of human societies facing fundamental historical transformations. The ongoing archaeological investigation of Belgic sites ensures that future generations will continue discovering new evidence for their achievements and contributions, maintaining their place in European historical consciousness as more than Caesar's bravest of all the Gauls, but as sophisticated societies whose legacy enriches our understanding of ancient European civilization.